There are nights that belong to history, and there are nights that belong to something older than history. Nights that belong to whatever keeps the ledger beneath the world. The one that does not forget. The 9th of the month. The year Millennium chose to end its long silence, was the second kind of night. London did not know this yet. London knew only that the sky had begun to burn. The Zeppelins had come in low over the Thames an hour before midnight. Black shapes blotting out a moon that had already gone the color of old blood, and from their bellies had poured the first waves of the Letztes Bataillon, chippers and foot soldiers, laughing, screaming, delighted, because to a vampire soldier raised on Millennium's doctrine, joy and slaughter had long since become the same word. Fires took the old brick terraces on the east side first, then the docks, then, section by section, the city's nerve began to fail, the way a great beast's nerve fails not all at once but in pieces, each piece a street, a church, a family sheltering beneath a kitchen table that would not save them. Sir Integra Hellsing stood in the war room beneath her family's estate, both hands flat against a map table gone soft with cigar smoke, and watched the pins move against her, not slowly, not in the ordered, comprehensible way a war was supposed to move. The pins moved the way blood moves through a wound, fast and wrong, and impossible to stop by simply wanting it stopped. "Sir," said Walter, at her shoulder, his voice as level as it always was, though even Walter's stillness had a texture to it tonight, a held breath quality. "Alucard and Miss Victoria are engaged along the southern perimeter. They are holding. Holding is not winning, Walter." "No, sir, it is not." She did not look up from the map. She did not need to. She had read enough after-action reports in her life, inherited enough of her father's war, to know what holding meant when it came out of Walter's mouth in that particular tone. It meant the numbers were bad and getting worse, and everyone on the ground already knew it, and no one was going to be the one to say it plainly to the woman who commanded them, because plain speech, in a war like this one, was sometimes its own kind of mercy withheld. Integra Hellsing had inherited an organization built for a smaller war than this. Vampires, ghouls, the occasional occult catastrophe. That was the Hellsing organization's mandate, its purpose since her ancestor had first bound the monster in the basement to a chain of his own blood. It had never been built to stand against an army. Not a real one. Disciplined and vast and unfeeling as a machine, commanded by a man who smiled the way other men breathed, constantly, and without meaning behind it. Millennium had spent 50 years in the dark building precisely the war Hellsing had never trained for, and now it had arrived all at once, all up front, like a bill finally come due. She had not slept in 2 days. She would not sleep tonight either. She lit another cigar with hands that did not shake. That, she had promised herself long ago, would never shake, not in front of the men who needed her steady. And she looked at the map, and she tried to find the shape of a war she could still win. It was in this hour, this particular hour of fire and failing arithmetic, that the sky above Vauxhall tore, not burned, tore. There is a difference, and the handful of soldiers who saw it from the ground would spend what remained of their lives trying to explain that difference to people who had not been there and never quite managed it. Fire is a color. This was an absence of color. A wound opened directly in the air itself, violet black at its edges the way a bruise is violet black at its edges, and through that wound, for 1 full second, London soldiers looked into somewhere that was not London, was not perhaps even entirely the same universe as the one they had been born into, and then the wound closed, and something had come through it. He landed on the roof of a burning warehouse with the unhurried economy of a man stepping off a train he had ridden 1,000 times before. No impact tremor, no stagger. He simply arrived, the way gravity arrives, the way a decision arrives once it has already been made, and for a moment he only stood there, coat settling around him, and looked out at the burning city, with an expression that was not fear, was not even surprise, but something closer to recognition. The particular, weary recognition of a man who has seen a great many worlds end, and has learned what it looks like in the first 10 seconds, before anyone else has quite understood what they are watching. Jin-Woo had crossed thresholds like this before. Not this one precisely. No dungeon gate, no monarch's realm, no ruler's authority had ever deposited him in a city of vampires and burning zeppelins, and a war between 3 factions who did not yet know a 4th had arrived. But he knew the shape of catastrophe, the way a soldier knows the shape of a battlefield before the smoke clears. And this was catastrophe, wearing an old, elegant European face. Gothic spires silhouetted against fire. The particular screaming that comes from people who understand, correctly, that the thing killing them enjoys it. He had been in the middle of closing a gate back home, a routine excavation of a dungeon break gone unexpectedly deep. Peru and Egress at his flanks, the last of the mana readings settling into stillness, when the floor of the dungeon's lowest chamber had simply stopped being floor. He remembered the sensation less as falling and more as being read, the way a book is read, some vast attention passing over him and finding him, for reasons he did not yet understand, worth pulling through. The Ashbourne's authority did not falter with him, even here. He could feel it immediately, the way a man feels his own pulse, that low, constant hum of dominion that had not left him since the day he became what he was. Whatever had brought him here, it had not touched what he was. He raised one hand, almost idly, testing, and felt the shadows of the burning warehouse beneath him respond. Eager, familiar, waiting. Good, he thought. Whatever this place is, I still have my army. He looked down at the street below, at a cluster of things that were not quite human, laughing as they herded a group of fleeing civilians into a dead-end alley, with the patient cruelty of predators who already know the outcome and are simply enjoying the anticipation. And Jin-Woo felt something in his chest settle into a very old, very familiar shape. Not rage exactly. Rage was for men who still had something to prove. This was quieter than rage. This was the flat, unhurried certainty of a king, looking at trespassers on land he had not yet claimed, but fully intended to. Arise, he said, to no one, to the shadow of the warehouse roof beneath his boots. And the word did not echo, because it did not need to. The shadows simply obeyed. Below, in the alley, the Major's chippers had chosen for their sport. A young woman named Dana Whitfield was doing the arithmetic of her own death. She was 19. She worked at a bakery on a street that no longer existed, having burned an hour earlier along with the family who had owned it since her grandmother's time, and she had run in the direction everyone else was running, which had turned out, as it so often does in catastrophes, to be the wrong direction. There were 4 of them cornered here. Herself, an old man clutching a framed photograph as though it were a shield, a boy no older than 12, and a woman with a broken ankle who had stopped screaming some time ago and simply stared at the ground, waiting. The chippers advanced without hurry. That was the worst part, Dana would think later, if there was a later. The lack of hurry. They did not fear anything getting in their way. Something got in their way. It rose out of the alley's own shadow, not from behind them, not from the mouth of the alley, but from the ground itself, as though the darkness pooled in every gutter and doorway of London had simply been waiting its whole existence for a reason to stand up. It was vast, chitinous, violet black, mandibles the length of a man's forearm, and it did not roar or announce itself. It simply moved, with an economy of motion that was almost courteous, and the first chipper's head was no longer attached to the rest of him before the sound of the movement had finished reaching Dana's ears. The others tried to scatter. They did not manage it. Dana Whitfield would spend the rest of her life, a life that, against every possible calculation she had run in that alley, continued, trying to describe what she saw next to people who had not been there. A young man in a black coat, standing at the alley's mouth with his hands loosely at his sides, shadow pouring off his shoulders like something between smoke and living silk, watching the massive insectoid thing finish its work, with the mild, approving attention of an employer checking on a job well done. He said something to it in a language she didn't recognize, not Korean, not quite, or not only, and it inclined its horned head to him with a formality that seemed strange on something built like a siege engine. Then he looked at her, at all four of them, huddled against the brick. "You're safe," he said, in English carrying only the faintest accent, and something about the flatness of the statement. No comfort performed in it, no reassurance offered as theater, just a fact delivered because it happened to be true now, made her believe it more than any amount of gentleness would have. "What?" the old man started, still clutching his photograph. "What are you?" Jin-Woo considered the question with the same unhurried attention he gave most things. He had been asked some version of it more times than he could count, in more worlds and dungeons and desperate last stands than he cared to number, and the honest answer had gotten longer and stranger with every year of his life. Tonight, he decided, was not a night for the honest answer. "Someone who's going to make sure the rest of tonight goes differently than it was going to," he said, and turned to look back out at the burning street, at the shape of a city under a kind of siege he recognized bone deep, having built and broken sieges of his own for years. "Get somewhere underground, away from the fires. Don't come back out until it's quiet." They did not need to be told twice. Even the woman with the broken ankle found the strength to move, half carried by the boy, and Dana Whitfield looked back exactly once before the alley's corner took them out of sight, long enough to see the young man in black step out into the burning street alone, and the ground around him ripple and rise, dozens of shapes climbing up out of shadow to stand at his back like an honor guard summoned from the underworld itself. It did not take long for word of the anomaly to reach people whose job it was to care about anomalies. Alucard felt it before he heard of it, a disturbance in the particular texture of the night that had nothing to do with Millennium's chippers, or Iscariot's silver, or any of the flavors of violence he had spent 5 centuries learning to taste on the wind. He was 3 streets from the Thames, his coat soaked through with blood that was not entirely his own, a dozen dissolving vampire corpses steaming into ash around him, when he stopped mid-motion, head tilting, red eyes narrowing behind his glasses, in a way that Ceres Victoria, working a Harkonnen round into her cannon a short distance away, had learned over their short partnership to take very seriously. "Master," she called. "What is it?" Alucard did not answer immediately. He was looking south, toward Vauxhall, toward a column of something in the air that was not smoke, a thin violet-black thread rising and dispersing against the orange sky, present for a heartbeat and then gone, the way a scent is present and gone, except this had been felt rather than smelled, felt the way a predator feels the presence of another predator in territory it had assumed was uncontested. He had lived 500 years as the strongest thing in most rooms he entered. It was a fact so foundational to him that he rarely thought about it consciously anymore, the way a mountain does not think about being tall. And yet standing here, in a city he had bled for and killed for, and would go on killing for, until Integra released him from the chain, or the world ended, whichever came first, Alucard felt, for the first time in longer than he cared to calculate, something that was not quite fear, because fear had died in him centuries ago, along with most other ordinary human things, but was its close and ancient cousin. Interest. His mouth curved, slow, into something that was not entirely a smile. "Something new has come to London tonight, police girl," he said, and there was a note in his voice she had not heard before. Not the manic hunger he wore into most battles, but something quieter, older, almost reverent. something the night itself does not recognize. Is that bad? That, Alucard said, already turning south, coat billowing, remains to be seen. It has been a very long time since anything in this world was new to me, Saris Victoria. I intend to find out what it is before Integra's soldiers get themselves killed trying to understand it without me. Saris hurried after him, cannon slung over her shoulder, throwing one last uneasy glance at the horizon where that thread of violet black had risen and vanished. She did not have 500 years of instinct to draw on, but she had enough to know that when Alucard, her master, the thing London called a monster, and worse, the creature who had never once in her memory shown genuine uncertainty about anything, looked south with that expression on his face, something had just changed in the shape of the war they were fighting. Word reached the Vatican's people faster than it reached the Round Table, because Iscariot's intelligence in London had always run parallel to Hellsing's rather than through it, a rivalry as old as the schism that had made the two organizations necessary in the first place. Father Alexander Anderson received the report not through radio but through a young acolyte who found him mid-battle, blessed bayonets buried to the hilt in a chipper's chest, and simply shouted the essentials over the noise. Something came out of the sky over Vauxhall. It isn't Millennium's, it isn't Hellsing's, and it just tore apart an entire squad of the enemy without slowing down. Anderson withdrew his bayonets, letting the vampire beneath him crumble to ash, and allowed himself one long, considering breath. "Is that so?" he said, mostly to himself, wiping silver-flecked blood from one blade against his coat. There was a particular light in his eyes, the light of a man who had spent his life hunting monsters and had, somewhere along the way, come to genuinely relish the hunt for its own sake, independent of doctrine, independent of the war he was ostensibly fighting for God and the Vatican and Section 30, a third player. On this, of all nights, he straightened, cracking his neck, already moving toward Vauxhall at a pace that suggested he had no intention of waiting for orders from Maxwell before he went and saw for himself. Enrico Maxwell, when the report reached him at Iscariot's forward command position, took it rather less gracefully. He set down the report with the particular stillness of a man doing careful, furious arithmetic. "An unregistered supernatural asset," he said slowly, "appears in the middle of Millennium's invasion, annihilates a vampire squad without apparent difficulty, and no one, not our people, not Hellsing's, has the faintest idea what it is or where it came from." "That's the report, yes, Your Excellency," said the aide, unfortunate enough to be standing nearest him. Maxwell was quiet for a long moment, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. He had not clawed his way to the head of Section Serre by reacting to chaos with panic. Chaos, correctly read, was opportunity. A door standing open that a patient man could walk through while everyone else was still staring at the fact of its opening. "Find out what it wants," he said finally. "Find out who it serves, if anyone. And find out." His smile here was thin, calculating. The smile of a man already 3 moves ahead in a game only he could see the whole board of, whether it can be made an asset of the church, before Integra Hellsing thinks to ask it the same question. And in the war room beneath the Hellsing estate, Sir Integra Hellsing received her own version of the report, garbled, half-panicked, relayed through 3 different field units who had each seen only a fragment of what had happened in Vauxhall, and could not agree on what, precisely, that fragment had been. A monster. An army rising out of the ground itself. A young man who spoke to shadows, and they answered him like soldiers answering a general. She listened to the whole of it without interrupting, her cigar burning down to ash between her fingers, and when the last field report had finished stammering its way through an account no one present quite believed, she was silent for a long moment, looking down at the map table where the pins that marked Millennium's advance had, for the first time all night, stopped moving in that particular block of the city. Stopped. Not because Hellsing had held the line there, because something else had. "Walter," she said finally, very quietly. "Sir, I want everything we have on what happened in Vauxhall in the last hour. Every account, every fragment, however unreliable it sounds." She stubbed out the cigar with more force than the gesture strictly required, and when she looked up, there was something in her sharp blue eyes that had not been there an hour earlier. Not quite hope, because Integra Hellsing had learned young not to trust hope, but something adjacent to it, a recalculation. "And find Alucard. Tell him I want to know exactly what has decided to make itself at home in my city tonight, before it decides whether it's an ally, an enemy, or something this world has no category for at all." Outside, the fires of the Battle of London burned on, indifferent to the new arithmetic that had entered the war. But in a burning street in Vauxhall, a young man who had once been the weakest hunter alive stood at the head of an army, raised from a world that did not yet know his name, and looked out at a city that had never once, in all its long and violent history, hosted a war quite like the one that was now, unmistakably, beginning. The thing about a city on fire, Jin-Woo had learned across 100 worlds and 100 versions of catastrophe, was that it did not stay simple for long. Fire drew attention, attention drew factions, and factions, once drawn, rarely left a battlefield in better shape than they found it. He walked the burning length of a street called Kennington Lane, with Beru at his shoulder, and a dozen lesser shadow soldiers fanned out ahead and behind, and he did the thing he had always done in unfamiliar territory before committing to any strategy larger than survive the next 5 minutes. He watched. He listened. He let the shape of the war reveal itself to him one detail at a time, the way a hunter reads a dungeon before deciding whether to clear it floor by floor, or drive straight for the boss chamber. What he saw troubled him more than the fires did. The vampire soldiers, and he understood by now, from fragments of overheard radio chatter carried by fleeing soldiers, from the uniforms on some of the dead, that vampire was the word this world used for them, did not fight like the undead he had encountered in his own world's dungeons. Those had been mindless, driven by hunger or necromantic compulsion, predictable in the way that all mindless things were predictable. These fought with discipline, formations, a grim professional joy that suggested training, doctrine, an actual military structure behind the slaughter. Somewhere above him, still, the vast black shapes of the Zeppelins drifted like slow thunderheads, and every few minutes another wave of soldiers descended from them on lines, landing in the streets below with the crisp efficiency of paratroopers who had rehearsed this 100 times. This is not chaos, he thought, watching a squad of them execute a pincer maneuver against a cluster of retreating British soldiers 3 streets over, too far for him to intervene before it was already over. This is a war machine. Someone built this on purpose, over a long time, and unleashed it on purpose, tonight. He thought of the rulers back home, the cold economy with which they moved pieces across worlds. He thought of the architect, the Ashbourne's old rival, and the particular flavor of a war designed rather than merely fought. Whatever this was, whoever commanded it, it had the fingerprints of intention all over it, and intention, in Jin-Woo's long experience, was almost always worse than chaos, because chaos eventually exhausted itself, and intention did not stop until it achieved what it had set out to achieve. Jin-Woo. Beru's voice was a low rumble, mandibles clicking faintly around the words in the way they always did when the Ant King spoke aloud rather than through the bond. There is something else here, something that does not smell like the others. I feel it too. He had felt it for the last several minutes, in fact, a presence moving toward them with unhurried, deliberate speed, cutting a path directly through Millennium's own advancing lines, as though the vampire soldiers barely registered as an obstacle. Whatever it was not trying to hide, and it was not afraid of what it was walking through to reach him. Hold the others back. I want to see this one myself, first. He did not have to wait long. Alucard arrived the way weather arrives, not gradually, but all at once. A change in the pressure of the air that announced him a half-second before he stepped into visible range at the mouth of the street, coat torn in a dozen places and healing itself even as it moved, red eyes catching what little light the fires offered and throwing it back doubled. Behind him, 3 of Millennium's chippers lay in ruin, not so much killed as unmade, and he did not so much as glance back at them. Jin-Woo went very still. Not from fear. Fear was a currency he had spent so thoroughly across his years of climbing that very little in any world could purchase it from him anymore, but from the particular, focused attention a strategist gives to the first genuinely uncertain variable he has encountered in a long while. Because he could not read this creature the way he read almost everything else. There was no clean class to assign it, no obvious hierarchy of power he recognized from any bestiary he'd studied in 10 years of hunting. It felt old in a way that had nothing to do with the mileage of a long life, and everything to do with something closer to concept. A thing that had been a monster in humanity's imagination for so long, it had started to become one in truth. Alucard, for his part, stopped roughly 20 feet away, in the center of the burning street, and looked at Jin-Woo with an expression that had shed every trace of the manic hunger he wore into ordinary battle. What remained was something closer to genuine, delighted curiosity, the specific pleasure of a creature who has waited centuries, bored past the point most humans could imagine boredom extending, for something new to look at. "Well now," Alucard said, and his voice carried the particular timbre of a man addressing an equal for the first time in longer than he cared to admit. "I have walked this world for 500 years, little king. I have eaten kings and priests, and the occasional god who thought himself clever enough to test me. And I confess, I do not know what you are." Jin-Woo did not answer immediately. Baru shifted at his shoulder, mandibles flexing, ready, and Jin-Woo raised one hand, a small economical gesture, and the Ant King subsided, though every line of his massive chitinous frame remained coiled. "You could ask," Jin-Woo said finally, instead of guessing. Something in Alucard's grin widened, genuine amusement now, sharp-edged. "Manners, how refreshing, in a city that has forgotten them tonight. Very well. What are you, and what army did you bring into my city without so much as a by your leave?" "My name is Sung Jin-Woo." He said it flatly, without ceremony, the way a man states a fact rather than offers an introduction. "I don't know this world. I don't know your war. I know that I watched your enemies herding civilians into an alley to die slowly for their own entertainment, and I put a stop to it. And I intend to keep doing that for as long as I'm here, whether or not it's any of my business by whatever rules you people are fighting under." "Ah!" Alucard's grin did not fade, but something behind his eyes sharpened, recalibrated, the look of a man revising an assessment upward. A crusader, then. How dreadfully sincere. He tilted his head, studying the shadow soldiers fanned out at Jin-Woo's back with open, frank interest, the way a collector studies a specimen he has not previously catalogued. And these, not vampires, not ghouls, not familiars, not quite, though closer to that than anything else I might name. Dead things, given purpose, and made to march again. He laughed, low and delighted. "You raise armies from corpses, little king. Do you know what that makes you, in the language of this particular city?" "I don't much care what it makes me in your language," Jin-Woo said. "I care what it makes the people burning to death 3 streets from here, which is, alive a little longer than they'd otherwise be." For a moment, neither of them moved. The fires crackled. Somewhere distant a Harkonnen round detonated with a sound like the sky tearing, and neither of them so much as glanced toward it. Then Alucard laughed. A full, genuine laugh, the kind that came rarely to a creature who had, by his own long reckoning, seen every variety of human and monster posturing the world had to offer, at least a dozen times over. "I like you," he said, and there was no mockery in it, only the honest verdict of a being too old and too powerful to bother performing insincerity when the truth would do. "I do not say that often, and I have killed the last several dozen things I said it to shortly afterward, so do not take excessive comfort in it." He rolled his shoulders, coat settling. "My master will want to speak with you. Integra Hellsing. She commands the organization that has spent this city's entire existence keeping monsters like myself on a leash, tight enough to be useful and loose enough to be lethal to the right people. She is, at this very moment, trying to determine whether you are the former sort of monster or the latter. And what do you think I am?" Alucard's smile turned, for just a moment, almost thoughtful. "I think," he said slowly, "that you are something this world has never had to categorize before. Which means my master's usual instruments for that particular question, bind it, contain it, put it to use, put it down, may not apply cleanly to you. That troubles her, though she would never admit it in so many words. It does not trouble me." His eyes glinted. "I find it rather more interesting than troubling." Beru's mandibles clicked, low and warning. "Jin-Woo, this one is testing you." "I know." Jin-Woo held Alucard's gaze without flinching. Without the faint, instinctive deference most beings in most worlds eventually offered him once they understood what he was. It was, he thought, oddly refreshing. "I'm not interested in being anyone's asset, not Helsing's, not the Vatican's. I overheard that name on the radio too. And not yours, whoever you actually answer to beneath the theater. I came here by accident. I intend to close whatever door brought me here and go home the moment I've figured out how. Until then." His eyes flicked, briefly, toward the ruined alley 3 streets back, toward the memory of the 4 civilians he had sent underground. "I'm not going to stand by and watch a war happen to people who didn't ask to be in one. That's not a negotiating position. It's just what I'm going to do." Alucard studied him for a long moment, and something in the ancient creature's expression shifted. Not quite respect, not yet, but the early architecture of it, the way a foundation is laid before anyone can call the building complete. "Integra Hellsing," Alucard said, "is going to want to hear you say precisely that, in precisely that tone, little king. Come with me, or don't. I confess I am curious which you'll choose, and I have not been genuinely curious about a decision in a very long time." He turned, coat sweeping, already several steps into a walk that assumed compliance without demanding it. "But I will tell you this for free, since you have earned at least that much honesty from me tonight. This city has 3 armies already fighting over its corpse. Millennium, who came to burn it. Iscariot, who has been quietly hunting monsters within it since long before Millennium arrived, and would very much like to add you to that hunt's ledger. And Hellsing, who has spent 200 years keeping the other 2 from tearing this country apart entirely." He glanced back over one shoulder, red eyes gleaming, and there was something almost fond in the look, the fondness of an old predator toward something new and dangerous entering its territory. "A 4th army, appearing tonight of all nights, changes the shape of that entire equation. You would be wise to decide, quickly, which shape you intend to make it take." Jin-Woo watched him for a moment longer, weighing the offer, weighing the warning folded inside it. Then he looked back at Beru, and at the dozen shadow soldiers standing silent and patient at his back, and he made the calculation he had made 1,000 times before, in 1,000 unfamiliar dungeons. Better to understand the battlefield from the inside than to keep fighting it blind from the outside. "Lead the way," he said, "but understand something first. I'm not here to join anyone's war. I'm here to end up on the side of whoever's actually trying to stop the burning. Once I've had a chance to see who that really is. If that's your Hellsing woman, fine. If it isn't, his eyes went, for just a moment, flat and very old. Older than his young face had any right to carry. Then I'll deal with that too. Alucard's grin returned, wide and genuinely delighted. Good, he said. I was growing so terribly bored of everyone in this war already knowing exactly which side they were on. They had not gone 3 streets before the second contact of the night arrived. And this one came without Alucard's theater, without warning at all beyond a faint, silvered whistle in the smoke-thick air, a half-second before a blessed bayonet buried itself in the brick wall, not 6 inches from Jin-Woo's head. Well now, said a voice from the rooftop above, cheerful and manic in equal measure. And who's this then? Didn't expect 2 toys in one night. Father Alexander Anderson dropped from the rooftop with the loose, easy grace of a man for whom gravity was more suggestion than law, landing in a crouch amid the rubble, a second bayonet already drawn, and glinting silver in the firelight. His grin was wide, delighted, hungry in a way that had nothing to do with hunger for food, and everything to do with hunger for a worthy fight. The specific joy of a monster hunter who had begun, somewhere along his long and violent career, to genuinely love the hunt more than the cause it was fought for. Beru moved to intercept before the second syllable had finished leaving Anderson's mouth, but Jin-Woo raised a hand again, and the Ant King held, mandibles clicking with barely restrained frustration. You're Iscariot, Jin-Woo said, not a question. He had gathered enough from Alucard's warning to place the coat, the bayonets, the particular fervor in the man's grin. Section 13. I, for my sins, Anderson said, straightening. Twin bayonets held loose and easy at his sides. The posture of a man who could close the distance in a heartbeat, but was, for the moment, choosing patience. His pale eyes swept over Jin-Woo, over the shadow soldiers, over Beru, cataloging with the fast, practiced efficiency of a lifetime spent assessing threats before they could assess him. And you're the thing that's got half the wireless traffic in this city in a right state tonight. Raises the dead, does he? Marches an army up out of the ground like Lazarus's bigger, angrier brother. He tilted his head, and for just a moment something in his manic grin sharpened into genuine, professional interest. Vatican doesn't much care for competition in the resurrection business, lad. Bit touchy about that particular miracle. You understand? I'm not performing a miracle, Jin-Woo said evenly. I'm not resurrecting anyone. What I do to the dead isn't. He searched, briefly, for a way to explain a mechanic this world had no framework for. It isn't giving them their souls back. It's not a kindness, and it's not blasphemy. It's a tool, nothing more. Is that so? Anderson's grin didn't waver, but something behind his round glasses considered this with more weight than the casual tone suggested. And here I thought I'd heard every flavor of monster London had to offer. After all these years, he rolled one bayonet in his grip, an idle, habitual motion. Alucard's taking you to see the Hellsing woman, I'd wager, by the company you're keeping. Section 13 would very much like a word first, if it's all the same to you. His Excellency Maxwell has a particular interest in assets that appear out of nowhere in the middle of a war and prove themselves capable of gutting a vampire platoon without breaking stride. I'm not an asset. Everyone's an asset, lad, to someone. Anderson's grin widened, and for just a moment, something genuinely dangerous flickered behind the manic cheer. The reminder, plain and unhidden, of exactly how many things this priest had killed in his long service to a war he had come, somewhere along the way, to love for its own violent sake. Questions only ever whose. Now, he rolled his shoulders, settling into a stance that was unmistakably, cheerfully, a prelude to violence. I don't suppose you'd be willing to demonstrate what you can do for me personally, before I go making my report? Professional curiosity. It's been a long while since London handed me something I genuinely didn't know how to kill. Alucard, several paces ahead, turned back with an expression of open, delighted anticipation, clearly relishing the prospect of watching this unfold rather than intervening. Jin-Woo looked at the priest, at the manic grin, at the twin-blessed bayonets, at the particular, dangerous joy radiating off a man who had made peace, long ago, with dying in service of a fight he loved, and felt, for the first time since he had fallen through the tear in the sky, something that was almost nostalgia. He had met men like this before, hunters who had stopped being able to imagine a life outside the hunt. It rarely ended well for them, and it rarely ended well for whoever tried to talk them out of what they were. "I don't want to fight with you," Jin-Woo said. "Not tonight. I've got a city burning and I don't know this world well enough yet to know who's actually trying to stop that and who's just circling it." "Ah, but you see," Anderson said, already shifting his weight forward. Bayonets rising, grin stretching wider. "That's rather the trouble, lad. In this city, on this particular night, everyone's circling. The trick is finding out who's circling with a purpose. And then, without further warning, without the courtesy of a countdown, he closed the distance between them in a single, blurring stride, and the third contact of Sung Jin-Woo's first night in Hellsing's London began not with words, but with the ringing shriek of blessed silver meeting a shadow soldier's rising blade. Igris rose to meet the priest before Jin-Woo had finished forming the thought to summon him, the night-class shadow soldier's blade catching Anderson's leading bayonet with a shriek of metal on metal that threw sparks into the smoke-thick air, and for a half-second, the two of them held there, locked, testing each other's weight. Anderson's grin did not so much as flicker. If anything, it widened. "Oh, now we're talking," he said, and broke the lock with a wrenching twist that sent Igris skidding back 3 full paces across the rubble-strewn street, boots carving furrows in wet ash. "A proper night, is it? Not just corpses shambling about at your command. Someone built you with craft, lad." Igris said nothing. He rarely did. He simply reset his stance, the same disciplined, economical posture he had carried through 100 dungeon clears and border skirmishes back home, and came again, blade a silver-violet blur, and this time Anderson had to work for the parry, boots skidding, coat snapping around him as he pivoted to avoid a strike that would have opened him from shoulder to hip had it landed clean. Jin-Woo watched for exactly 2 exchanges before he understood the shape of the problem. Anderson was fast, inhumanly fast, faster than any human frame had any right to be. And beneath the manic grin, there was real skill there. Decades or perhaps centuries of accumulated technique, compressed into every strike. But more than that, he was healing. Jin-Woo watched a shallow cut open along the priest's forearm, where Igris's blade had grazed him. Watched the flesh knit itself shut again within a second and a half, faster than any regeneration Jin-Woo had catalogued outside of certain S-rank dungeon bosses. Not a vampire, he thought, filing the observation away with the same clinical efficiency he brought to any unfamiliar enemy. Something else, something the church made, or found, or blessed into this shape. "Enough," Jin-Woo said, and stepped forward himself. And the quality of the fight changed instantly. He did not summon a weapon. He rarely needed one against anything below a certain threshold, and he had not yet decided where, precisely, this priest sat on that scale. But the moment he entered the exchange directly, driving a palm strike toward Anderson's sternum that the priest barely managed to twist away from, fast enough that the air itself seemed to compress and release around the motion, Anderson's grin faltered for the first time since he dropped from the rooftop. "Ah," the priest said, skidding back, silver bayonets raised in a guard that was, for the first time, genuinely defensive rather than performative. "There we are then. I said I don't want to fight," Jin-Woo said, and there was no anger in his voice. only the flat, patient weariness of a man repeating himself to someone who had chosen not to listen the first time. "This is your last chance to walk away from one." Anderson laughed, a real laugh, delighted despite the fresh wariness in his stance. The laugh of a man who had spent his whole violent life searching for precisely this feeling and had almost given up finding it again. "Do you know," he said, circling now, bayonets weaving idle patterns in the smoke, "it's been the better part of a decade since anything in this city made me want to be careful. Vampires, ghouls, the Major's chippers. I go through them like a scythe through wheat, and half the joy's gone out of it for the going. And here you are, some manner of monarch, marching up out of a tear in the sky, with knights and armies at your back, and enough restraint not to have gutted me on the first exchange, when we both know you could have." "I could have," Jin-Woo agreed. "Then why didn't you?" Jin-Woo considered the question honestly, for a moment, before answering. "Because I don't know yet whether you're actually my enemy tonight, or just a man who's forgotten how to tell the difference between a fight and a war." He glanced, briefly, toward Alucard, who had settled against a shattered lamppost some distance off, arms folded, watching the exchange with the rapt, unhurried attention of a man enjoying genuinely excellent theater. "Your friend there seems to think I should be worried about which side of this I end up on. I'd rather spend tonight figuring that out than spend it fighting a man who might, tomorrow, be standing next to me against something worse." For a long moment, Anderson simply looked at him, the manic grin still present, but something calculating moving behind his pale eyes now. The first genuinely sober consideration Jin-Woo had seen from him since he'd dropped from the rooftop. Then, slowly, deliberately, the priest lowered his bayonets. "His Excellency Maxwell," Anderson said, "is not going to be pleased I let a resource this interesting walk without so much as a proper report on your capabilities." But then, his grin returned, sharp and genuine. "His Excellency's pleasure has never much dictated the shape of my evenings. I'll be watching you, lad. Monarch, king, whatever manner of thing you are beneath the coat. Section 13 doesn't forget faces, and it certainly doesn't forget this one." He sheathed both bayonets in a single fluid motion and, with the same loose, gravity-defying grace he'd arrived with, turned and vanished back up into the smoke-wreathed rooftops, calling back over his shoulder as he went, "Do try not to disappoint me by turning out to be just another monster, would you? I so rarely get to hope for better these days." And then he was gone, and the street was quiet, except for the distant, ongoing thunder of Millennium's assault several blocks away, and Alucard pushed off from his ruined lamppost with a low, appreciative chuckle. "Well handled," the vampire said, falling back into step beside Jin-Woo as they resumed their walk toward the Hellsing estate. "Diplomacy and restraint, from a man who could have painted this street with the good father's blood and lost nothing for the effort. My master will find that either reassuring or deeply suspicious. Possibly both. She has a talent for holding contradictory assessments simultaneously. It is, I think, why she has survived commanding this organization as long as she has." "I'm not trying to reassure anyone," Jin-Woo said. "I'm trying to understand this place fast enough to stop making mistakes in it. Everything I do here has weight I don't fully understand yet. What it means to your factions, what rules I'm breaking just by existing." He glanced sidelong at the ancient vampire beside him, at the easy, predatory grace with which Alucard moved, even in casual conversation. "You said your master keeps you on a leash. Bind it loose enough to be lethal, tight enough to be useful. Is that actually going to be her offer to me? Because I'll tell you now, I don't take leashes. Not from kings, not from gods, not from anyone in any world I've walked through." "I did not say it would be a leash," Alucard said, and there was something almost thoughtful in his tone now, the theater dropping away for just a moment. "I said that is the shape her instruments were built to offer. Whether they fit you is an entirely separate question, And I suspect, I hope, if I am honest, which I am rarely inclined to be, that they will not. His red eyes glinted sideways, appraising. It has been 500 years since I met something in this world that did not, eventually, fit into one of the shapes this organization has learned to bind. Vampires bind, ghouls bind, even I, in the end, bind, chained to a Hellsing's blood by a compact older than either of us. You do not smell like something that binds, little king. I find that rather refreshing, and rather more dangerous than my master is prepared for, and I confess I intend to enjoy watching her discover which of those two things proves true. They walked on through the burning streets in a silence that was, for the first time that night, almost companionable. An old monster and a new one, each taking the measure of the other and finding, against considerable odds, something worth respecting in what they found. The Hellsing estate's war room smelled of cigar smoke and cold stone and, beneath both, the particular metallic tension of a command post that had not stopped receiving bad news in hours. Integra Hellsing stood at the head of the map table when Alucard finally brought Jin-Woo through the estate's outer perimeter, past soldiers who stared openly, past Walter, who studied the newcomer with an old butler's quiet, comprehensive assessment and said nothing at all. And she did not rise from the table, did not offer her hand, did not perform any of the courtesies a lesser commander might have reached for in the face of the impossible. She simply looked at him, long, sharp, blue-eyed, the look of a woman who had spent her entire adult life learning to read threats faster than threats could read her. "Sung Jin-Woo," she said. Not a question. Walter, evidently, had already relayed what fragments of a name had made it back through the field reports. "You've been busy in my city tonight." "Your city is burning," Jin-Woo said. "I did what was in front of me to do. So I've heard. An entire chipper squad, dismantled without apparent effort. A priest of Section 13, engaged and, by his own account, relayed to us second-hand, and with considerable annoyance, permitted to walk away, rather than killed, when killing him would evidently have cost you nothing." Integra's eyes narrowed slightly, cataloging him the way she might catalog a weapon of uncertain provenance found on a battlefield, with interest, and with the specific caution of someone who had been burned before by things that looked, at first glance, too useful to be dangerous. That is either extraordinary restraint or extraordinary strategy. I find I have not yet decided which. "Maybe it's just neither," Jin-Woo said. "Maybe it's that I don't kill people I don't need to kill, and I hadn't decided yet whether I needed to kill him. A luxury," Integra said, "that this war has not extended to very many of us in quite some time." She straightened, cigar smoke curling between her fingers, and something in her posture shifted. Not softening exactly, but recalibrating, the way a commander recalibrates when a new variable proves to have its own internal logic, rather than being simply chaotic. "Alucard tells me you fell through some manner of rift, mid-battle, from a world not your own, that your power is your own, unaltered by whatever brought you here, that you command an army raised from the dead of that world, not this one." Her gaze sharpened. "I've spent 200 years of family history keeping this country from being overrun by exactly the kind of thing you claim to be, an unbound power of unknown loyalty and unknown limit. You will forgive me if I do not simply take your word for your intentions. I wouldn't ask you to." Jin-Woo held her gaze without flinching, the same flat, unhurried steadiness he'd offered Alucard and Anderson both. "I'm not here to join your organization, Sir Hellsing. I'm not here to be bound, or classified, or made into an asset for whichever faction gets to me first. And I understand there are at least 2 others in this city who'd very much like to try." A faint, humorless smile touched his mouth. "I'm here because I fell into the middle of your war by accident, and until I find a way home, I intend to stop as much of the dying in front of me as I can, because that's what I do, in every world I've ever found myself standing in." If that happens to align with what you're fighting for tonight, good. We can be useful to each other. If it doesn't, his eyes went briefly, genuinely cold. I'll deal with that when it happens, but I won't be leashed, and I won't be conscripted, and I won't be a weapon in someone else's war, just because I have the power to be one. I've been that before, in my own world, under someone else's authority. I didn't care for it. Integra studied him for a long moment, long enough that Walter, standing quietly at her shoulder, shifted his weight almost imperceptibly, the closest thing to visible tension the old butler ever betrayed. Then, unexpectedly, something in Integra Hellsing's expression eased. Not trust, not yet, but the particular, weary respect of one commander recognizing the shape of another commander's principles, even across a gulf as wide as the one separating their two worlds. "Good," she said, and stubbed out her cigar with a decisive motion. "Because if you'd stood there and offered me your unconditional loyalty in exchange for shelter, I would have trusted you considerably less than I do now." She turned to the map table, gesturing him forward with a curt motion of one hand. Millennium landed with a force I estimate at several thousand vampire soldiers, commanded by a man who calls himself the Major, and treats this entire war as theater staged for his own amusement. Section 13. The Vatican's monster hunters, whom you've already met one representative of, are fighting their own war within this war, nominally against Millennium, but with considerably less interest than I'd like in coordinating with my organization to do it. And somewhere beneath all of it, this city's ordinary people are dying by the hundreds while all three of us maneuver around each other, instead of simply ending the thing killing them. Her blue eyes met his, steady, assessing, and, for just a moment, something almost like an offer passed behind them. "I am not going to ask for your loyalty, Sung Jin-Woo. I am going to ask you a simpler question, and I want an honest answer, not a diplomatic one. Tonight, in this city, on this particular battlefield, are you willing to fight with us? Not for us, with us, as whatever manner of ally you're capable of being, on whatever terms you're willing to set." Jin-Woo looked at the map, at the pins marking Millennium's advance, at the sections of the city already lost, at the small, precise mark someone had made in Vauxhall where, an hour ago, he had stopped a squad of chippers from finishing what they'd started in an alley. "Yes," he said, "for tonight, on my terms." Integra Hellsing allowed herself, for the first time since he had entered the room, the faintest ghost of a smile. "Then let's discuss," she said, "exactly what those terms are going to be. Because the Major's forces have not stopped advancing while we've been having this conversation. And I suspect, before this night is finished, all three of our organizations are going to learn a great deal more about each other than any of us would prefer. Outside, beyond the estate's ancient stone walls, London burned on beneath a sky that had already torn once, and, Integra Hellsing suspected, watching the new king in her war room settle into a chair he did not quite trust yet, was very far from finished revealing what else it might let through before this particular war reached its end. The terms, when they finally settled into something both parties could live with, were simpler than either Integra Hellsing or Sung Jin-Woo had expected them to be. He would fight alongside Hellsing's forces for the duration of the night's engagement. No further, no formal commission, no chain of command that placed him beneath Integra's authority in any sense he was unwilling to accept. He would not take Hellsing's orders as commands. He would take them as intelligence, information about where the greatest danger lay, and decide for himself whether and how to answer it. In exchange, Hellsing would share what it knew about Millennium, about the Major, about the particular architecture of a war that had been 50 years in the building before it ever reached London's streets, and would not, for as long as the arrangement held, attempt to classify, contain, or study him as though he were a specimen rather than a person who happened to command an army. You understand, Integra said, as Walter laid a fresh map across the table. This one marked with troop positions gathered from a dozen scattered field units. That I am extending you a degree of trust I have not extended to anyone outside this organization in longer than you have likely been alive. I do this because the alternative, treating you as a hostile unknown while Millennium burns half my city, is a luxury I cannot currently afford. Do not mistake pragmatism for naivety. I wouldn't, Jin-Woo said. I've made the same calculation myself, more times than I can count. Trust what you can verify. Verify as you go. He studied the map, the dense clusters of red markers denoting Millennium's advance, and something in his posture shifted, sharpened. The particular attentiveness of a man who had spent a decade of his life learning to read a battlefield the way other men read a page. Where's the heaviest concentration? Not the front line, the center of it. Wherever this major is actually commanding from. Walter answered before Integra could. We believe Millennium's command elements are operating from within the city's financial district, the old exchange buildings, largely evacuated before the invasion began, offering both defensible ground and symbolic weight. The Major has a documented taste for theater, sir. Striking at the heart of what this country calls its wealth and stability would appeal to him considerably. And the front line between here and there? Contested, badly. Integra's finger traced a rough arc across the map, a wound drawn in ink over a city that was, at that very moment, bleeding in truth a few miles away. My forces are holding 3 defensive positions along this line, but holding is costing us more than we can sustain. Alucard and Miss Victoria have been the difference between holding and collapsing at 2 of the 3. The third, her jaw tightened slightly, is commanded by Captain Rowe, a good soldier, human. He will not hold much longer without support, and I have none left to send him. Then that's where I start, Jin-Woo said. Alucard, leaning against the war room's stone wall with the loose, satisfied posture of a man watching a play unfold exactly as he'd hoped, let out a low chuckle. Direct, I approve. His red eyes glinted toward Integra. Shall I accompany our new ally, or would you prefer I remain where I am already earning my keep? Stay on the southern line, Integra said, already turning back to the map. Already 3 steps ahead into the next calculation. I don't yet know what he's capable of at scale. I would rather learn that from a safe distance than from directly beside him. Prudent, Alucard murmured, though something in his tone suggested he found the caution faintly, fondly amusing. Very well. Try not to disappoint her, little king. I have grown rather attached to the idea of you. Captain Edmund Rowe had been fighting a losing battle for the better part of 3 hours, and he had made his peace with it, in the particular, practical way that soldiers make peace with losing battles, not by giving up, but by narrowing his ambitions down to the smallest achievable good. He was no longer trying to win, he was trying to buy time. Every minute his line held was a minute Hellsing's evacuation convoys had to clear civilians from the eastern boroughs, and if that was the only victory available to him tonight, he intended to wring every second out of it he could before the line finally broke. It broke, or came close to breaking, at 02:47 hours, when Zoran Blitz's forward element hit the barricade at Lambeth Bridge with the kind of coordinated ferocity that suggested she had been saving her best soldiers for precisely this moment. Zoran herself did not fight in the front rank. She rarely needed to. She stood back, tattooed eye gleaming faintly beneath its patch, and let her illusions do the work her blade did not need to, twisting the perception of Rowe's soldiers so that allies became enemies in their sightlines for just long enough, just often enough, to fracture a defensive line that had held, grimly, gorgeously, against everything Millennium had thrown at it until now. Fall back, Rowe was shouting, dragging a wounded soldier by the collar of his jacket, even as 3 more of his men fired into what they believed, in the horrible, twisted logic of Zoran's illusion, was an enemy soldier, and was, in truth, one of their own. Fall back to the second position, now. The barricade gave. Chippers poured through the gap with the eager, delighted screaming that had become the signature sound of this entire invasion, and Rowe turned, weapon raised, already calculating how many of his men he could get behind him before the wave reached them, already accepting, with the flat, exhausted resignation of a man who had run this calculation too many times tonight, that the answer was probably not enough. The wave did not reach them. It rose out of the bridge's own shadow first, a wall of violet-black shapes climbing up out of the Thames wet stone, with a silence that was, in its own way, more unsettling than any battle cry, and where Millennium's chippers met that wall, they simply stopped existing in any coherent sense, torn apart with a clinical, economical brutality that had nothing of Millennium's theatrical joy in it, and everything of pure functional purpose. Rowe stared, weapon still raised, mouth slightly open, as a young man in a black coat walked out onto the bridge behind the rising wall of shadow soldiers with the unhurried calm of someone taking a stroll through a park rather than the center of a battlefield. "Captain Rowe?" Jin-Woo said, over the noise, and something about the plain, unornamented courtesy of using the man's actual name and rank cut through Rowe's shock faster than any display of power could have. "Sir Hellsing sent me. Pull your wounded back to the second position. I'll hold this one." "You'll—" Rowe looked at the shadow soldiers still rising, still advancing, tearing through what remained of Zoran's forward element with a speed that made the last 3 hours of desperate, grinding attrition look almost quaint by comparison. Alone? Not alone. A faint, humorless smile touched Jin-Woo's mouth as he looked out at the retreating remnant of the chipper wave, at Zoran Blitz's silhouette withdrawing into the smoke on the bridge's far side. Her tattooed eye narrowed in something that was, for the first time that night, genuine and unhidden alarm. "I've got about 200 soldiers who don't get tired and don't ask questions. Go, Captain. Get your people somewhere safe. I've got the bridge." Rowe hesitated a moment longer, the particular hesitation of a man who had spent 3 hours learning not to trust anything that arrived too easily, too conveniently, in the middle of a losing fight. And then, because the alternative was watching more of his men die for a hesitation that changed nothing, he nodded, sharp and grateful, and began pulling his wounded back toward the second position, shouting orders that, for the first time all night, carried something other than the flat certainty of a man managing a retreat rather than fighting toward anything. Jin-Woo watched him go, then turned back toward the bridge, toward the smoke where Zoran's forces had withdrawn to regroup, and allowed himself, for just a moment, the particular satisfaction of a problem solved cleanly. It did not last. Zoran Blitz did not report failure well. It was not in her nature, had not been since long before Millennium's serum had remade her into what she now was, and the sight of an entire forward element unmade in under 2 minutes by something she could not immediately categorize sent her withdrawing not in panic, but in the cold, professional fury of a soldier, recalculating an engagement she had assumed, incorrectly, was already won. "Report," came the Major's voice over her earpiece, jovial as ever, as though the collapse of an entire assault wave were simply an amusing anecdote rather than a tactical failure. "You sound cross, Fräulein Blitz. Did the bridge not go as planned?" "There's something new on the field," Zoran said, her voice tight, controlled, betraying nothing of the alarm still coiled in her chest. "Not Hellsing's usual assets. Something that raises the dead as soldiers and tears through chipper formations like they're nothing. I lost the entire forward element in under 2 minutes." There was a pause on the line, the particular considering pause of a man whose delight in war was, beneath all the theater, underpinned by a genuine and formidable strategic mind. How curious, the Major said finally, and something in his tone had shifted, sharpened, the jovial theater dropping away just slightly to reveal the cold calculation beneath. We have accounted for every asset the Hellsing organization possesses, Fräulein Blitz. Every vampire, every soldier, every trick Sir Integra has kept in reserve for a night like this one. This, something new, is not on any ledger I have prepared for. A low, delighted chuckle, the theater sliding neatly back into place over the calculation like a mask resettling. How wonderful. I confess, I had begun to worry this evening's entertainment would prove predictable. Pull your forces back from the bridge. Do not engage this new variable further until we understand what it is and where it came from. I will have the doctor begin an analysis immediately, and I believe, his voice took on a note of genuine, unsettling anticipation, I shall want to see this for myself before the night is through. Jin-Woo held Lambeth Bridge for another 40 minutes, though after Zoran's withdrawal, the fighting there dwindled to isolated skirmishes rather than the sustained assault it had been. He used the lull to do what he always did in unfamiliar territory once the immediate crisis had passed. Assess, catalog, prepare for whatever came next. Beru returned to his side sometime past 3 in the morning, mandibles clicking with the particular rhythm that indicated he had something to report. Jin-Woo, the shadow soldiers you raised from the chippers we destroyed here. They are unstable. That got his full attention. Unstable how? Weaker than they should be, for what they were in life, and there is a resistance in them that I have not encountered raising the dead of our own world, as though something in what they were before still fights the binding, even now. Jin-Woo considered this, turning the problem over with the same methodical care he gave any unfamiliar variable. Vampires. Undead creatures who had, in life or in whatever counted for life in this world's peculiar physics, already been remade once by whatever process turned a soldier into one of Millennium's chippers. Raising them again, layering his own shadow binding over whatever process had already claimed them, was clearly not the same clean transaction it was back home, where the dead were simply dead, and his authority over them absolute. Another mechanism this world doesn't follow the same rules for, he thought. I need to understand this before I rely on it in a fight that actually matters. Don't use them in the front line, he said finally. Not until I understand what that resistance actually is. Keep them in reserve, keep them for scouting, but don't count on them holding against anything serious. Beru inclined his massive horned head. Understood. Igris says the night-type soldiers, those raised from your own world's dead, not this one's, show no such instability. Good, that's something at least. Jin-Woo looked out across the bridge, at the fires still burning across the London skyline, at the distant silhouettes of Millennium Zeppelins drifting like slow, patient thunderheads above a city that had not yet begun to understand the full shape of what had entered its war tonight. He thought of the Major's voice, relayed to him secondhand through a Hellsing radio operator who'd intercepted the tail end of Zoran's transmission. Jovial, delighted, treating an entire war as entertainment staged for his private amusement. Someone's enjoying this, he thought, and something cold and old settled behind his eyes. The particular flat anger of a man who had learned, across a decade of climbing through worse things than most people ever imagined existed, exactly what he thought of those who treated other people's deaths as entertainment. I've killed things like that before, whole worlds of them, sometimes. I don't imagine this one's going to be any different, once I finally meet him. He did not know, standing on that bridge in the last dark hour before dawn, how soon that meeting would come, or how much of London would burn between now and then. But he understood, with the particular, weary clarity of a man who had learned to read the shape of a coming storm long before it broke, that the quiet, testing skirmishes of this first night, Alucard's curiosity, Anderson's professional interest, Zoran's tactical withdrawal, were not the war. They were the war introducing itself, feeling out the edges of a new variable before committing to the fight in earnest. The real war, he suspected, had not yet decided what it thought of him. It would not stay undecided for long. Dawn over London that morning did not bring relief. It brought only visibility, a gray, smoke-choked light that let the city's people see, for the first time in clear detail, exactly how much of their home had burned in a single night. The fires along the Thames still smoldered. The financial district, where Hellsing's scouts had confirmed Millennium's command elements were dug in, stood wreathed in a haze that never quite cleared, as though the buildings themselves had begun to exhale something foul. Integra Hellsing had not slept. She stood once more at her map table, cigar burned down to its last inch, and studied the reports that had accumulated through the night's remaining hours with the particular, weary focus of a commander who understood that the true test of this war was not the first night's chaos but what came after it, the long, grinding calculation of who could sustain the fight longer. The lines held, Walter reported, setting a fresh stack of dispatches beside her. Barely, in places. We lost the eastern boroughs entirely. Millennium has consolidated its hold there, and shows no sign of withdrawing. But the southern and western perimeters remain, in large part due to Alucard, Miss Victoria, and a faint, almost imperceptible note of something like wry approval entered the old butler's voice. Our new ally's efforts at Lambeth Bridge. His methods concern me, Integra said, though there was less accusation in it than simple honesty. Walter, I have fought monsters my entire life. I understand vampires. I understand ghouls. I understand the peculiar violence of Section 13's blessed relics. I do not understand a man who raises an army from the dead of a world none of us have ever heard of, and does so with what appears to be genuine, considered restraint. Restraint is not something I have learned to expect from power of that magnitude. Perhaps, Walter said, that is precisely why it concerns you, sir. We have spent 2 centuries learning to predict monsters by their appetites. This one does not appear to have the appetites we've learned to predict. Integra said nothing for a long moment, turning the observation over. Then, from the estate's outer courtyard, a commotion rose. Raised voices, the particular tension of soldiers uncertain whether to escalate or stand down. And she was moving toward the sound before Walter had finished registering it. Cigar abandoned on the table's edge. She found Jin-Woo standing in the courtyard. Beru and a small honor guard of shadow soldiers arrayed loosely behind him, facing down a delegation that had arrived, apparently, sometime in the last 10 minutes, and had not been expected by anyone. The delegation numbered 3, a young officer in a crisp Vatican-affiliated uniform, visibly nervous, a second, older man whose bearing suggested considerably more authority than his subordinate rank implied, and at their center, unmistakable even at a distance, Enrico Maxwell himself, dark hair slicked back, purple cassock immaculate despite the ash still drifting on the morning wind, his oily, practiced smile already deployed like a weapon of its own. "Sir Integra," Maxwell said, turning as she emerged, his smile widening with the particular pleasure of a man who enjoyed, above almost anything else, catching a rival slightly off balance. "How fortuitous. I confess I had hoped to speak with your new asset." His eyes flicked, briefly, deliberately, toward Jin-Woo. "Before you had the chance to fully claim him for your own ledger. It seems I am not quite too late." "He is not on my ledger, Enrico," Integra said, her voice carrying the particular flat coldness she reserved exclusively for representatives of Section 13. "He is not on anyone's ledger. You would know that if you'd bothered to ask him yourself before arriving at my estate uninvited." "Uninvited, perhaps." Maxwell's smile did not waver, but hardly unreasonable, given the circumstances. An unregistered power of considerable magnitude appeared in this city last night, engaged Millennium's forces directly, and, by the account of one of my own men, declined a full engagement with a servant of the church, out of what he characterized, and I quote, as not wanting a fight tonight. His gaze settled fully on Jin-Woo now, sharp and assessing beneath the oily courtesy. The Vatican has a considerable interest in understanding exactly what manner of power has entered our war, Mr. Sung. I trust you'll forgive the directness of my visit. Time, as I'm sure you've noticed, is rather a precious commodity this morning. Jin-Woo studied the man for a long moment before answering. The practiced smile, the careful, calculating eyes beneath it, the particular quality of a politician who had learned to wear sincerity as a costume, rather than feel it as anything genuine. He had met men like this before, too, in every world he'd ever walked through. Power always attracted them, the way carrion attracted certain kinds of bird. What do you want exactly? Jin-Woo asked, without preamble, without the courtesy he'd extended to Anderson the night before. Something about Maxwell's smile did not earn that courtesy the way the priest's manic honesty had. Directness. How refreshing. Maxwell's smile flickered, just slightly, recalibrating. Very well. The Vatican, through Section 13, would welcome an arrangement with a power of your caliber. Resources, sanctuary, recognition, should this war end, and this world need to understand what, precisely, walked out of the sky and helped save it. Hellsing's arrangement with you. His eyes flicked toward Integra, sharp. Whatever it consists of, is doubtless generous by the standards of a secular organization. But the Church can offer something Sir Integra cannot. Legitimacy, standing, a place in this world's understanding of itself, rather than a footnote in a secret organization's classified ledgers. I don't need legitimacy, Jin-Woo said. I need to find a way home. Everything else is just noise. Something in Maxwell's practiced smile tightened, almost imperceptibly. A pragmatic answer, though I wonder, has it occurred to you, Mr. Sung, that Sir Integra's organization, for all its considerable resources, has no more idea how to send you home than my own does? That you may in fact be here for considerably longer than either of us currently anticipates, and that the manner in which you spend that time, whose ledger you appear on, whose favor you cultivate, may matter a great deal more than you presently believe. It was, Jin-Woo had to admit, a fair point, and he did not enjoy how fair it was. He had not, in the chaos of the last 12 hours, allowed himself to sit with the possibility that this might not be a problem he solved quickly, that the door that had opened beneath him in that dungeon back home might not simply open again on request. Maybe, he said finally, carefully, giving nothing away in his tone, but that doesn't change my answer. I'm not joining Hellsing's ledger, and I'm not joining yours. I fought alongside Sir Integra's soldiers last night, because they were the ones dying in front of me when I had the power to stop it. If your soldiers had been dying in front of me instead, I'd have done the same for them. That's not loyalty to an organization. That's just, he searched, briefly, for the right word, and settled on the plainest one available. Decency. I don't sell that. Not to you, not to her, not to anyone. For a long moment, Maxwell simply looked at him, the practiced smile settling into something colder, more calculating, the mask slipping just enough to reveal the ambitious, patient man beneath it. How very noble, he said finally, and there was an edge beneath the courtesy now, thin and sharp. I do hope that particular philosophy survives contact with a longer war, Mr. Sung. Principles are a luxury this city has been steadily running out of for the better part of 50 years. He inclined his head, a gesture that managed to convey both courtesy and threat in equal measure, and turned to go, his delegation falling into step behind him. At the courtyard's edge he paused, glancing back once more, his smile returning, thin and knowing. Do give some thought to my offer nonetheless. Section 13 has a long memory for those who decline us graciously, Mr. Sung, and an even longer one for those who decline us at all. I should hate for our next conversation to occur under less amicable circumstances. He left without waiting for a response, his delegation trailing behind him through the estate's outer gate, and Integra watched them go with an expression that mingled genuine relief with a flicker of something more troubled. He does not make threats idly, she said quietly, once the gate had closed behind them. Whatever else you think of Enrico Maxwell, and I assure you, I think considerably less of him than even his own tone suggests you should. He does not forget a slight, and he does not forgive an asset he wanted and did not get. You have made an enemy this morning, Sung Jin-Woo, whether or not you intended to. I've made worse enemies for worse reasons, Jin-Woo said, watching the gate where Maxwell had disappeared. I'd rather have an honest enemy than a false ally. At least I know where I stand with him. Integra studied him for a moment, something in her sharp blue eyes shifting. Not quite warmth, but the particular, grudging respect of a commander recognizing a fellow traveler in the exhausting, thankless work of holding to principle in a war that made holding to anything difficult. Come inside, she said finally. There's a briefing you should hear, and coffee, that is, at this point in the morning, considerably more important than either of us currently appreciates. Millennium did not retreat during the night, Sung Jin-Woo. It consolidated. And I suspect the Major has spent every hour since dawn broke deciding exactly how he intends to introduce himself to you personally. Because make no mistake, a man who commands theater the way he does will not be content to learn about you from field reports for very much longer. She was not wrong. Several miles across the ruined city, in the requisitioned upper floor of what had once been a grand Victorian bank, the Major stood at his own window overlooking a column of smoke rising from Lambeth Bridge, a china teacup balanced with surprising delicacy in one gloved hand, and considered, with the particular relish of a man who had waited 50 years for a war worth savoring, the reports of the previous night's unexpected new variable. Fascinating, he said, to the room at large, though the only other occupant was the doctor, hunched over a bank of instruments salvaged and modified from equipment far more advanced than this era's London had any right to possess, cataloging readings that made increasingly less sense the longer he studied them. An army that marches up out of shadow itself, commanded by a boy who cannot possibly be older than 25, capable of unmaking an entire chipper platoon without so much as raising his voice. Tell me, Doctor, what does your equipment make of him? The doctor did not look up from his instruments, his voice carrying the flat, clinical detachment that had made him invaluable to Millennium's project across 5 decades of quiet, monstrous research. Inconclusive. Whatever process animates his soldiers does not correspond to any necromantic or vampiric signature in our records. The energy readings are unusual, consistent in certain respects, with something closer to authority than to biology, as though the dead simply obey him, not because he has forced anything upon them, because obedience is, in some fundamental sense, what they have become. Authority. The Major turned the word over with evident pleasure, sipping his tea. How delightfully appropriate, for a war that has always, beneath all its theater, been a question of who commands and who is commanded. He set the teacup down with a soft, precise click. I confess, Doctor, I find myself unable to resist the temptation. 50 years I spent building this war, this glorious, endless spectacle of soldiers who cannot die twice, and on the very night it finally begins in earnest, the universe hands me a rival army, commanded by a boy who has apparently mastered the exact same trick, from an entirely different direction. His smile, wide and genuinely delighted, was the smile of a man who had found, against every reasonable expectation, something new to love about his own war. I should very much like to meet him, properly, not through field reports and second-hand accounts of skirmishes at bridges, but face to face, soldier to soldier, army to army. That would be unwise, the doctor said, without inflection, still studying his instruments. We do not yet understand the extent of his capabilities. A direct engagement, before we have gathered sufficient data. Oh, doctor. The major's laugh was warm, genuine, entirely unbothered. When has understanding ever been a prerequisite for a good war? We shall gather our data in the field, as we always have. Send word to Rip Van Winkle. I believe it is high time this new King of Shadows learned exactly what kind of orchestra he has wandered into the middle of, and exactly how loudly Millennium intends to play. Outside, the smoke continued to rise over a city that had survived its first night against an invasion 50 years in the making, and now stood, unknowingly, on the edge of learning that the war it thought it understood had, in the space of a single burning night, become something far larger, far stranger, and far more dangerous than anyone, Hellsing, Iscariot, or Millennium alike, had prepared themselves to fight. Rip Van Winkle received her orders from the Major with the particular, cheerful professionalism she brought to every assignment, humming a low, familiar bar of melody to herself as she checked the chamber of her rifle and adjusted the brim of her Tyrolean hat against the gray morning light. She had fought in wars before this one, had, in fact, died in one, more than a century past, before Millennium's science had found a use for a soldier whose aim had never once, in life or in whatever came after, failed to find its mark. She did not share the Major's theatrical delight in spectacle for its own sake. She simply enjoyed her work, the way a craftsman enjoys any task performed with genuine skill, and she approached the morning's assignment, locate and assess the new variable, engage if the opportunity presented itself, report back regardless, with the same quiet, professional care she brought to everything. She found her opportunity a little after 10 in the morning, on a rooftop overlooking a street where Hellsing's forces had established a forward supply position, and where, according to the intelligence the Major's people had gathered through the night, the new variable had been seen more than once, moving between engagements with the particular restless energy of a man who did not sit still while people needed help. She was not disappointed. She caught sight of him a little before 11, the black coat, the shadow soldiers arrayed loosely around him, as he oversaw the transfer of wounded civilians from a collapsed shelter to a waiting convoy of Hellsing vehicles, his attention, for the moment, entirely absorbed by the practical, unglamorous work of triage rather than combat. Rip Van Winkle settled into her firing position with the patient, unhurried care of a craftsman preparing her finest work, raised her rifle, and began, softly, to sing. The bullet that followed her voice out across the rooftops did not travel like an ordinary round. It sang with her, a thin silver thread of sound trailing the shot's path, each note of the aria she'd chosen marking its progress through the smoke-thick air, with an eerie, beautiful precision, and it was aimed not at Jin-Woo directly, not yet, but at the Hellsing convoy's lead vehicle, where a dozen wounded civilians waited to be evacuated. A test, Jin-Woo understood, in the half-second between the first note reaching his ears and the shot's arrival, some instinct honed across a decade of ambush and dungeon break, teaching him to read the intention behind an attack, before the attack itself had finished landing. Not trying to kill me, trying to see what I do when something I can't stop directly threatens people I can't afford to lose. He did not have time for a more elegant solution. He simply moved, faster than the eye of any ordinary soldier could have tracked, a blur of black coat and violet-black shadow, and the bullet that would have torn through the convoy's fuel line instead found the flat of his palm, absorbed with an impact that cracked the stone beneath his boots, but did not so much as stagger him. Silence, for a moment, across the street. The convoy's driver stared. The wounded civilians stared. And on the rooftop above, Rip Van Winkle lowered her rifle slightly and allowed herself, behind her wire-rimmed glasses, a small, genuinely impressed smile. My, she murmured, to no one, already working the bolt of her rifle for a second round, fast enough to catch a bullet mid-flight. The Major will be very pleased to hear that. Jin-Woo's eyes found her rooftop position almost instantly, the particular, focused attention of a man who had just identified a threat and intended to end it before it could repeat itself. And Baru, sensing the shift in his posture, was already moving, mandibles clicking with barely restrained hostility. No, Jin-Woo said, sharp, before the Ant King could close the distance. Get the convoy clear first. She's not trying to break through. She's testing me. If I chase her onto that rooftop and leave this convoy exposed, that's exactly what she wants. He was right, and Rip Van Winkle's small smile widened slightly as she watched him make precisely the calculation she'd hoped to force. Restraint. Again, the same maddening, admirable restraint that had already cost Zoran an entire forward element the night before, prioritizing the civilians in front of him over the tactical opportunity to eliminate a sniper who had just tried to kill them. Interesting, she thought, already withdrawing from her position with the same unhurried care she'd arrived with, humming softly to herself as she moved. A soldier who fights like a saint. The Major does so love a contradiction. By the time Jin-Woo had the convoy safely clear and turned his full attention back to the rooftop, she was gone, leaving nothing behind but the faint, fading echo of a melody and the memory of a bullet that had, for the first time since he'd arrived in this world, made him genuinely consider the possibility that a single, ordinary-looking soldier might pose a threat he could not simply overpower through raw force alone. The reports of Rip Van Winkle's engagement reached Integra Hellsing within the hour, relayed through Walter with the particular efficiency the old butler brought to even the most alarming news. A testing probe, Integra said, once the report had finished, turning the implication over with the flat, practiced calculation of a woman who had spent her life reading intention behind enemy movement. The Major isn't attempting to eliminate him yet. He's gathering data, the same way we would, in his position, against an unknown variable of this magnitude. She looked up from the map table, and something in her expression had sharpened, the earlier caution giving way to something closer to genuine concern. That troubles me more than an outright attack would have, Walter. A man who tests before he commits is a man who intends, eventually, to commit with everything he has. Agreed, sir. Walter set a fresh dispatch on the table, his expression, as ever, giving little away. There is also this. Section 13's forward elements have been observed shadowing our new allies' movements throughout the morning, not engaging, simply watching. Maxwell appears to have taken his own counsel regarding this morning's conversation rather more seriously than our guest may have anticipated. Of course he has. Integra's jaw tightened. Enrico does not simply accept a refusal and move on. He gathers information, waits for an opportunity, and finds a way to make the outcome he wanted appear inevitable in hindsight. I want to know the moment Section 13's shadowing becomes anything more active than observation. She straightened, cigar smoke curling between her fingers. 3 factions now taking a very close, very active interest in one man. Walter, I do not like the shape that arithmetic is beginning to take. Nor do I, sir. Walter's voice carried, for just a moment, something almost like genuine unease. Rare, for a man who had weathered 5 decades of Hellsing's particular brand of catastrophe, with unshakable composure. If I may offer an observation, whatever brought Sung Jin-Woo to this city, accident or otherwise, his presence has already begun to reshape the war's entire balance in ways none of the 3 original parties anticipated. Millennium is curious, Iscariot is acquisitive, and we, a faint, dry note entered his tone, are, I think, the only faction thus far attempting to treat him as a person rather than an asset. I would suggest that advantage is worth protecting, sir, more carefully than we have protected it thus far. Integra considered this for a long moment, looking out through the war room's narrow window at the gray, smoke-hazed morning beyond, at a city that had survived one night of this war, and now faced, with grim, gathering certainty, however many more nights it would take before the balance finally broke one way or another. "Find him," she said finally. "Not to summon him here, not to lecture him on the danger he's placed himself in simply by existing in this city. Just find him, Walter, and make sure he understands he has somewhere safe to return to when this day's fighting is done. I suspect that is worth more to a man in his position than any amount of strategic advice I could offer him." He found Jin-Woo a little past noon in the ruins of a small parish church that had, against considerable odds, survived the previous night's fires largely intact. Its stained glass shattered, its pews scattered, but its stone walls still standing, offering shelter to a cluster of refugees Hellsing's forces had not yet managed to evacuate. Jin-Woo sat on the church's broken altar steps, alone for the moment. Beru and the rest of his shadow soldiers dismissed to rest or patrol at the church's perimeter, and there was something in his posture, shoulders slightly bowed, eyes fixed on nothing in particular, that Walter recognized immediately, having seen its shape on a great many soldiers across a great many wars. Exhaustion, not physical. Walter suspected, correctly, that physical exhaustion was a concept largely foreign to a man of Jin-Woo's evident power. This was the other kind, the kind that came from holding, hour after hour, the weight of other people's survival on shoulders that had not asked to carry it. "May I sit?" Walter asked, and did not wait for permission before lowering himself, with the careful, precise economy of an old man who had learned long ago exactly how his joints preferred to be treated, onto the altar step beside him. "You're Sir Integra's butler," Jin-Woo said, not quite a question. "Alucard mentioned you. Among my other duties, yes." Walter's mouth curved into something that was almost a smile. "I have served the Hellsing family in one capacity or another for the better part of 5 decades, Mr. Sung. I have seen, in that time, a great many things this world does not officially admit exist. I find I am rarely surprised anymore." His pale eyes settled on Jin-Woo with quiet, careful attention. "You look tired, if you'll forgive my saying so. Not in body, I suspect. Something else." Jin-Woo was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the church's shattered stained glass, at the fragments of colored light scattered across the stone floor by whatever sun managed to filter through the morning's lingering smoke. "I keep doing this," he said finally, and there was something raw in it, something he had not let show in front of Integra, or Alucard, or any of the powers currently circling him, weighing him, deciding what use he might be to their particular war, falling into places that are burning. Back home, before all of this, he gestured vaguely, encompassing the church, the city, the whole impossible shape of the night and day behind him. "I spent 10 years climbing out of being the weakest person I knew, becoming strong enough that nothing could ever make me feel that helpless again. And I keep ending up in exactly the same position anyway, standing in the middle of something burning, trying to save as many people as I can reach, knowing I can't save all of them, and having to live with the math of that every single time." He looked down at his own hands, at fingers that could tear through vampire soldiers without visible effort, and had, the night before, held a bullet meant for a convoy of frightened civilians. "I'm strong enough now that almost nothing in any world I've walked through can actually hurt me. But strong enough to save everyone? That's a different kind of strong. I don't think that exists. I don't think it's ever existed, for anyone." Walter listened to this without interrupting, without offering the easy, hollow reassurance a lesser man might have reached for. When Jin-Woo finished, he was quiet for a moment longer, considering his response with the same careful precision he brought to everything. I am going to tell you something, Mr. Sung, that I have told very few people in my long service to this family, he said finally. I was a soldier myself, once, long before I became what I am now. Angel Dust, they called me, in another war, a smaller one than this, though it did not feel smaller while I was fighting it. I have buried more comrades than I can accurately count. I have made the exact calculation you are describing, who I could reach, who I could not, who I had to leave behind so that others might live, more times than any man should have to make it, and I have carried every single one of those calculations with me for the whole of my life since. His pale eyes held Jin-Woo's, steady, unflinching. It does not get easier, this math you're describing. I would be lying to you if I promised it did. But I will tell you what I have learned from carrying it for 50 years, since it may be of some use to you. The calculation is not a failure, Mr. Sung. It is not proof that your strength has a limit that shames you. It is simply the shape that caring about people takes, when the world you're standing in is larger and crueler than any one person's strength can fully answer. The men and women who feel nothing when they cannot save everyone, those are the ones who should frighten you. Not yourself. Jin-Woo was quiet for a long moment, something in his expression easing, very slightly, the particular loosening of a weight that had, perhaps, needed simply to be spoken aloud and acknowledged by someone who understood its shape from the inside. Sir Hellsing send you to find me? He asked finally, a faint, genuine note of dry humor returning to his voice. She did. Walter allowed himself a small smile. Though I confess, I would have found my way to you eventually regardless. I find I am, against my own considerable professional caution, rather curious about you, Mr. Sung. It has been a very long time since this city offered up anything genuinely new. He rose, smoothing his coat with the same precise economy he brought to every motion. She wished you to know you have somewhere safe to return to, when today's fighting is finally done. I would extend that a step further. If you'll permit an old soldier's presumption, you have, I think, found yourself among people in this city who are inclined to see you as more than the sum of your usefulness to them. That is rarer than you may currently appreciate, in a war shaped like this one. I would encourage you to let yourself trust it, at least a little, while it lasts. He turned to go, and Jin-Woo watched him walk back toward the church's broken door, an old man carrying the weight of decades and wars past, with a composure that had clearly cost him more, over the years, than it ever let show. Walter, Jin-Woo said, and the old butler paused, glancing back. Thank you. Walter's smile this time was entirely genuine. You are quite welcome, Mr. Sung. Rest, if you can manage it, even briefly. I suspect this war has a great deal more to show you before it is finished, and I do not believe any of it intends to be gentle about the showing. He was not wrong. That evening, as the gray daylight finally began surrendering back to dark, word reached the Hellsing estate that Millennium's forces had begun a new offensive along the city's northern perimeter. Larger, more coordinated than anything attempted the previous night, driven by an urgency that Hellsing's intelligence officers, poring over intercepted radio traffic, could only attribute to one cause. The Major, it seemed, had grown tired of testing from a distance. He wanted at last to see the new King of Shadows for himself. The northern offensive began at dusk with a sound London had not yet heard in this war. Not the chaotic, overlapping roar of chippers advancing in loose formation, but something closer to music, if music could be built entirely from engines and marching boots, and the low, groaning thunder of tank treads on cobblestone. Millennium's forces advanced along Camden's ruined streets in genuine formation for the first time since the invasion began, disciplined ranks moving with the crisp, terrible precision of soldiers who had trained for this exact moment across decades of quiet preparation, and at their head, in an open-topped command vehicle that offered no cover at all because its occupant had no need of any, rode the major himself. He sat with a china cup balanced on his knee, sipping tea as casually as a man out for a Sunday drive, round glasses catching the light of the fires his own soldiers had set. His broad, permanent smile turned toward the darkening sky, with an expression of genuine, uncomplicated pleasure. "Beautiful," he murmured, to the driver, to no one in particular, to the war itself. "Do you smell that, Corporal? Cordite and smoke, and the particular fear of a city that has just realized its enemy was not, in fact, showing its full hand last night. There is no perfume in this world quite like it." Behind him, in a second vehicle, the doctor monitored a bank of instruments with his usual clinical detachment, tracking energy signatures across the advancing formation's forward edge. "Our forces will make contact with Hellsing's northern defensive line within the hour," he reported. Probability of the shadow entity's involvement, given his established pattern of responding to civilian endangerment, 83%. "Only 83? The major's smile widened, delighted. "Raise the stakes then, Doctor. I do so love improving odds through direct participation." He set down his teacup and reached for the radio handset mounted beside him, and his voice, when it carried out across Millennium's forward ranks, carried none of its usual jovial theater, only the flat, commanding clarity of a general who intended, tonight, to be heard by more than his own soldiers. "Forward elements, advance on the civilian shelter at Camden High Street," he said. "Take your time. Make noise. I want our new friend to hear us coming from as far away as possible." The shelter at Camden High Street held some 300 people, families who had fled the previous night's fires, elderly residents too frail to evacuate further, a scattering of Hellsing soldiers assigned to hold the position until proper transport could be arranged. It was, in the major's calculated arithmetic, precisely the kind of target that would draw Sung Jin-Woo directly into a confrontation neither side had yet had. Not a testing skirmish, not a probing shot from a rooftop, but a genuine, full-scale engagement between Millennium's forces and whatever this new king of shadows truly commanded at full strength. Jin-Woo felt the shelter's danger before Hellsing's own communications relayed it. A growing pressure in the air, the particular quality of a large force moving with deliberate, unhurried intent, and he was moving before Integra's field report had finished crackling over the radio in Walter's hand. "He's already gone," Walter reported, lowering the handset, something in his expression tightening. "Sir, this has the shape of a trap." "I know it does," Integra said, already reaching for her own coat, already calculating the fastest route to Camden herself. "Alucard. Already aware, my master." The vampire's voice came from the war room's doorway, where he had appeared with his usual soundless suddenness, red eyes gleaming with an anticipation he made no effort to hide. "I felt the shift in the air the moment our new friend committed to Camden. The major wishes an audience with him, it seems. I confess, I find myself rather looking forward to watching that particular introduction unfold. This isn't theater, Alucard." Integra's voice carried an edge sharper than usual. "If the major has committed his forward elements to drawing Jin-Woo into a direct engagement, he has done so because he believes he can learn something from it. Or worse, because he believes he can end the problem entirely before it grows any larger. Get to Camden. Now." Jin-Woo arrived at the shelter's perimeter to find Millennium's forward ranks already advancing along the high street in that same disciplined, deliberately loud formation. Soldiers marching in step, engines revving with theatrical, unnecessary volume, the whole procession less a genuine assault than a performance staged specifically for an audience of one. "He wants me to see this," Jin-Woo understood immediately, watching the formation's slow, confident advance. "He's not trying to hide the trap. He's inviting me into it." He considered, for a fraction of a second, the wisdom of refusing the invitation, of pulling back, coordinating with Hellsing's approaching reinforcements. meeting this on ground and terms of his own choosing, rather than the Major's. But 300 people sheltered behind him in a building that would not survive even a fraction of the force currently marching toward it. And Jin-Woo had made this particular calculation too many times, in too many worlds, to hesitate now simply because the terms were unfavorable. Beru, Igris. He did not need to raise his voice. Both were already at his side, already reading the shape of the coming fight in the set of his shoulders. Full deployment. Whatever this is, it's not a testing probe anymore. The ground around the shelter's perimeter opened in a wave of rising shadow soldiers. Dozens, then hundreds, arraying themselves in defensive formation between the advancing Millennium ranks and the building full of frightened civilians behind them. And for the first time since his arrival in this world, Sung Jin-Woo committed the full visible weight of his army to a single engagement. Millennium's forward ranks did not break formation at the sight. They had been briefed, drilled, prepared specifically for this moment by a commander who valued discipline above almost anything else, and they advanced into the Shadow Army's defensive line with the same grim, professional competence they'd shown against Hellsing's forces the night before. The clash that followed was, by any reasonable measure, extraordinary. Two armies built from the dead of two entirely different worlds meeting in the ruined streets of a third, violet-black shadow tearing through ranks of undead soldiers, even as those soldiers fought back with a ferocity and coordination Jin-Woo's forces had not yet encountered in this world. But it was also, Jin-Woo understood within the first several minutes, a diversion. The bulk of Millennium's forward ranks were not, in fact, pressing toward the shelter itself. They were simply holding, testing, absorbing his shadow soldier's attention while something else moved. He felt it a moment too late, a presence approaching from an entirely different angle, fast, unhurried, radiating a confidence that had nothing to do with the disciplined soldiers currently locked in combat around him. The Major's command vehicle rolled to a stop at the mouth of the high street, precisely at the edge of the engagement, close enough to observe everything and far enough to remain, for the moment, entirely uninvolved. He stepped down from it himself, china teacup somehow still in hand, and walked forward through his own advancing ranks with the loose, unbothered ease of a man taking an evening stroll through a garden he owned. "Enough," he said, and though his voice was not raised, it carried across the entire engagement with an authority that made every soldier on both sides pause, if only for a heartbeat. "Hold positions, all of you. I believe our young friend and I have rather a lot to discuss, and I find I dislike shouting over the sound of gunfire when a civilized conversation will do." Jin-Woo turned to face him fully for the first time, shadow soldiers still arrayed protectively around the shelter, Beru coiled and ready at his shoulder, and found himself looking at a man whose jovial, round-faced smile carried, beneath its theatrical warmth, something genuinely, deeply unsettling, the smile of a man who had made peace, decades ago, with treating catastrophe as his life's great and abiding pleasure. "You're the Major," Jin-Woo said. "I am." The man's smile widened, delighted, as though the simple act of being recognized were itself a gift. "And you, I am given to understand, are Sung Jin-Woo, the Shadow Monarch, though I confess I rather prefer the boy who fell out of the sky and ruined my beautifully planned invasion. Has a certain ring to it, don't you think?" He sipped his tea, entirely unbothered by the ranks of shadow soldiers standing between himself and the very civilians his own forces had marched here to threaten. "I have spent 50 years, young man, building the single greatest army this world has ever seen. An army that does not tire, does not fear, does not know the meaning of surrender. Soldiers plucked from every great and terrible war human history has ever produced, given eternal purpose in service of one final, glorious spectacle. And then you arrive, on the very night I finally unveil that masterpiece, commanding an army that does precisely the same trick, from an entirely different direction, with an ease that makes 50 years of my careful work look almost, his smile sharpened, just slightly, amateur by comparison. You must understand, Mr. Sung, how very much I have been looking forward to this conversation. I don't care about your masterpiece, Jin-Woo said flatly. I care about the 300 people you marched an army toward tonight to get my attention. That's not a conversation starter. That's a threat, dressed up in tea and manners. Is it? The Major's smile did not waver, though something in his tone shifted, sharpened, the jovial theater thinning just enough to reveal the cold, calculating strategist beneath. Perhaps. Or perhaps it is simply the only language I was confident would guarantee your full, undivided attention, given how thoroughly you ignored every subtler introduction my people attempted over the last day. He gestured, almost lazily, at the ranks of soldiers still holding position around them. I could have simply ordered my forces to overwhelm that shelter directly, Mr. Sung, and tested your limits against a genuine atrocity, rather than a staged one. I did not. I find that restraint, on my part, deserves rather more credit than you're currently extending it. You want credit for not murdering 300 civilians to get a meeting. Something cold entered Jin-Woo's voice, old and flat and entirely without patience. I've killed things for less than that. Worse things than you, in worse places than this. I do not doubt it. The Major's eyes glinted, genuinely, dangerously delighted by the threat rather than deterred by it. That is rather precisely why I find you so fascinating, young man. You are, by every measure my doctor's instruments can offer, a being of genuinely apocalyptic capability, an army commander, a raiser of the dead, a power that by rights ought to have simply conquered whatever it wished the moment it arrived in this world. And yet here you stand, arguing with me about the ethics of a staged threat, protecting 300 strangers from a war that is not even yours, holding to a restraint that costs you tactical advantage at every turn. He tilted his head, considering, genuinely curious. Tell me, in your own world, this power you carry, did you build it to protect, or did the protecting simply happen to be what you found worth doing with it, once you had it? Jin-Woo did not answer immediately, caught, despite himself, by the genuine curiosity beneath the question, the first honest thing, he suspected, the Major had said since arriving. Both, he said finally. I built it because I was tired of being helpless. I use it to protect because I remember, too clearly, what helpless felt like. His eyes hardened. What did you build yours for? The Major's smile, for just a moment, went somewhere older, somewhere genuinely distant, the particular, weary distance of a man who had spent so many decades justifying a war to himself that the justification had long since curdled into something closer to genuine belief. War, he said simply, glorious, endless, undying war, the purest expression humanity has ever produced of what it truly is. Beneath every pretense of civilization it drapes over itself. I did not build my army to protect anything, Mr. Sung. I built it because I believe, with everything I am, that war is humanity's truest art form, and I intend to paint the single greatest masterpiece that art has ever produced, before I am finished. His smile returned, sharp and genuine. You and I think, want rather different things from the power we've each spent our lives building. I find that difference considerably more interesting than any similarity between us. Then we're done talking, Jin-Woo said. Take your soldiers and go, or don't, and I'll finish what your forward ranks started. The Major laughed, a genuine, delighted sound, entirely unbothered by the threat. Oh, I do hope you mean that, young man. I have been waiting 50 years for an opponent worth the effort of genuinely trying against. And I confess, after tonight's small demonstration, I begin to suspect I have finally found one. He turned, already walking back toward his command vehicle, teacup still somehow balanced in one hand, and called back over his shoulder without looking back, his voice carrying easily across the suddenly, tensely silent street. Withdraw the forward elements. We have learned what we came to learn tonight, and I find I am rather more interested in savoring this discovery than in spending it carelessly on a battle I am not yet prepared to properly stage. A pause, and then, almost fondly, until next time, Shadow Monarch. I do hope you understand. This was never truly about that shelter at all. It was an introduction, and I promise you, our next conversation will be considerably less polite. He climbed back into his command vehicle, and Millennium's forward ranks began, with the same disciplined, unhurried precision they'd advanced with, to withdraw, and Jin-Woo stood in the sudden, ringing quiet of the high street, watching the enemy retreat from a fight neither side had actually finished, and understood, with a cold, settling certainty, exactly what Walter had tried to warn him of that afternoon. This war had not yet decided what it thought of him, but the Major, it seemed, had already decided precisely what he intended to do about that uncertainty, and Jin-Woo suspected, watching the last of Millennium's command vehicles vanish back into the smoke-choked dark, that whatever came next would be very far from the restrained, testing skirmishes of these first 2 days. Behind him, the shelter's 300 people remained, unharmed, alive, saved by a margin that felt, in the settling quiet, considerably narrower than he would have liked to admit. He turned back toward them, toward Beru and Igris and the rest of his soldiers standing patient guard around the building's perimeter, and allowed himself, for just a moment, the particular, weary relief of a fight that had ended without the cost it might have carried. It would not last. He understood that too, standing in the ruined street beneath a sky still hazed with smoke. But for tonight, at least, 300 people would see morning who might otherwise not have, and in a war shaped like this one, Sung Jin-Woo had learned, across a decade of worse nights in worse worlds, that a margin like that was sometimes the only victory worth counting. The Round Table convened at dawn, 3 days into the Battle of London, in a bunker beneath Whitehall that had not seen use since the last war fought on English soil at this scale, and Sir Integra Hellsing, standing before 12 of the most powerful men in Britain's secret aristocracy, understood within the first 5 minutes that this meeting had been called not to coordinate strategy, but to interrogate her. Sir Integra, Lord Islands, eldest of the Round Table's members and the closest thing the body had to a unified voice, steepled his fingers across the long oak table with the particular deliberateness of a man who had rehearsed his opening. We are given to understand that a fourth power has entered this war, an entity capable of raising armies from the dead, engaging Millennium's forces directly, and operating entirely outside the command structure of this council, this government, or your own organization. I trust you understand why several members of this table find that circumstance considerably more alarming than reassuring. I understand it entirely, Integra said, meeting his gaze without flinching. The same flat, steady composure she brought to every confrontation with the men who had, since her father's death, spent a decade underestimating her authority and overestimating their own patience for doing so. I would ask this council to understand, in turn, that Sung Jin-Woo has, in the space of 3 days, held a defensive line that would otherwise have collapsed, prevented the deaths of at least 300 civilians in a deliberate Millennium trap, and done so without demanding a single concession from this government, beyond the courtesy of being treated as an ally, rather than a specimen. I do not command him, my lords. No one does. That is precisely why he has proven useful, and precisely why I would counsel this council against any attempt to change that arrangement by force. A power we cannot command, said another voice. Lord Farlane, younger than most at the table, his tone carrying the particular sharp anxiety of a man who had built his entire career on the illusion of total control. is a power we cannot trust, Sir Integra. History does not remember unbound entities kindly. What happens the day this Shadow Monarch decides his interests no longer align with ours? What happens if Iscariot succeeds where you have failed and secures his loyalty for the Vatican instead of this country? Then this country will have lost an ally it never truly had a claim to in the first place, Integra said, sharp and unyielding, because it spent its energy trying to leash something instead of earning its trust honestly. My lords, I did not build this organization's 200-year survival by pretending every monster in this world could be chained the same way. Alucard himself is proof enough of that particular lesson, and he, at least, is bound by blood to this family. Jin-Woo is bound by nothing but his own conscience, and I would remind this council that his conscience has, thus far, proven considerably more reliable than several factions in this war who are nominally bound to serve Britain's interests. A long, uncomfortable silence settled over the table. Lord Island studied her for a long moment, something calculating moving behind his old, sharp eyes. You are asking this council to simply trust an unregistered, unbound power of apocalyptic capability, he said finally, on nothing more than your own judgment and 3 days of favorable field results. I am asking this council, Integra said, to recognize that London is still standing this morning, in no small part because of that power, and to weigh that fact honestly against whatever theoretical risk a handful of you have spent this meeting imagining, rather than observing. If any member of this table believes they can offer Jin-Woo a better arrangement than the one I've extended him, one that earns his continued cooperation rather than demanding it, I invite them to attempt it personally. I suspect they will find the negotiation considerably more difficult than issuing directives to soldiers who have no choice but to obey them. No one at the table volunteered. Very well, Lord Island said finally, though the reluctance in his voice made clear the matter was far from settled in the council's collective mind. The arrangement stands, for now, Sir Integra, on your authority and your accountability, should it prove to be the miscalculation several members of this table clearly believe it to be. But I would counsel you, watch him closely. Power of that magnitude, however well-intentioned today, rarely remains a comfortable guest for long. Jin-Woo learned of the Round Table's meeting second-hand, relayed to him that evening by Walter, with the same careful diplomatic phrasing the old butler used for most difficult news, and found, to his own mild surprise, that it troubled him less than he might have expected. They're not wrong to be nervous, he said, sitting on the low stone wall of the estate's garden, watching the evening's first stars struggle to show through the lingering haze of smoke that had not fully cleared the London sky in 3 days. I've seen what unbound power does to people who don't have anyone reminding them what it's for. I've been that, for a little while, right after I first understood what I'd become. It's not a comfortable thing to trust, even when you mean well. And yet, Walter said, settling onto the wall beside him with his usual careful economy of motion, you have, thus far, given this council and this organization every reason to trust you regardless. That is not nothing, Mr. Sung, whatever their anxieties suggest otherwise. Maybe. Jin-Woo was quiet for a moment, turning something over. Back home, when I first started climbing, getting stronger, I mean, floor by floor, dungeon by dungeon, there was a point where I stopped being afraid of monsters and started being afraid of what I might become if I let the power change who I was faster than I could keep up with it. I watched that happen to other hunters. Good people, mostly, at the start. Power doesn't corrupt anyone who wasn't already halfway there, but it does make the halfway easier to finish walking. He glanced sideways at Walter, something searching in the look. You said something to me at the church, about the men and women who feel nothing when they can't save everyone. I think about that a lot. I think that's the actual danger your council should be worried about. not whether I'm strong enough to be dangerous, whether I stay someone who cares about the difference between using that strength and just having it. Walter considered this for a long moment, the evening settling quiet and gray around them both. "For what it is worth, Mr. Sung," he said finally, "I have buried a great many soldiers in my long life who stopped asking themselves that question somewhere along the way, and I have watched every single one of them become something considerably worse than the war that made them. You are still asking it. I would count that, myself, as considerably better evidence of your character than any report the Round Table has commissioned." 3 streets from the estate's outer perimeter, in a narrow alley that had, until recently, housed a bakery not unlike the one Dana Whitfield had once worked in before it burned, Father Alexander Anderson knelt over a fresh set of chipper corpses with the particular, methodical focus of a man conducting an investigation, rather than simply cleaning up after a skirmish. "There," he murmured, to the young acolyte crouched beside him, gesturing at a faint, violet-black residue still clinging to the wound that had ended the nearest corpse's second death. "See that? Not blessed silver, not fire. Something else entirely did this, and not our new friend directly either, or I'd have felt it in the air the way I did the other night. This is one of his soldiers' work, on its own, without him standing over it. What does that tell us, Father?" "It tells us," Anderson said, straightening, wiping his gloved fingers against his coat, "that our Shadow King's army doesn't need him hovering over every kill to function. That they operate with genuine independence, genuine judgment, once he's set them loose on a given task." He turned the observation over with evident professional relish, the same appetite for a genuinely worthy puzzle that had drawn him to Jin-Woo in the first place. "His Excellency Maxwell will want that particular detail in my report, though I confess I intend to phrase it rather more carefully than his ambitions likely deserve." His pale eyes glinted, thoughtful, beneath his round glasses. "There's a difference, lad, between an asset and a soldier. Maxwell keeps trying to buy the boy as though he's the former. I begin to suspect, the longer I watch him work, that he's rather more the latter. The kind that chooses his own war, and fights it on his own terms, regardless of what any of us offer him in exchange." He straightened fully, gathering his coat around him against the evening's chill. "I find myself rather looking forward to the day Maxwell finally understands that, and rather more looking forward to whatever the boy does about London's war, once he finally stops testing all of us, and starts actually fighting it in earnest." That night, in the requisitioned bank that served as Millennium's forward command, the Major reviewed the doctor's compiled data on their new adversary, with the particular, focused delight of a general assembling the opening moves of a campaign he had already begun, in his own mind, to relish. "Restraint," he murmured, flipping through page after page of field reports. The bridge, the shelter, the countless smaller engagements across 3 days, in which Sung Jin-Woo had, again and again, chosen the harder, costlier path of protecting, rather than simply overwhelming. Genuine, consistent restraint, in a being capable of ending this entire war in an afternoon, should he choose to commit fully. Fascinating. Tell me, Doctor, in your professional estimation, what does a man do with power that vast, when he has spent 3 days proving, again and again, that he refuses to use the full breadth of it? "I would speculate," the doctor said, not looking up from his instruments, "that such a man is either extraordinarily disciplined, or has not yet been given sufficient reason to abandon that discipline. Precisely my own thinking." The Major's smile widened, slow and genuinely delighted, the smile of a man who had, after 50 years of careful, patient construction, finally found the single missing ingredient his masterpiece required. "Then I believe, Doctor, it is high time we gave him one." He set the reports aside and turned to the window and looked out over a city that had, for 3 days, held against the greatest army this world had ever assembled, and smiled the particular smile of a man who had, at last, found a worthy final act for the war he had spent his entire life building toward. "Prepare the Letztes Bataillon's full deployment," he said, "and send word to Zoran Blitz. I believe it is time our new friend learned exactly what happens when restraint meets an enemy who has none left to offer in return." Zoran Blitz had spent 3 days nursing a grievance the size of the crater Lambeth Bridge had left in Millennium's original battle plan, and when the Major's orders finally reached her, full deployment, full authorization, no further restraint required, she received them with the particular, focused satisfaction of a soldier who had been waiting for exactly this permission since the moment her forward element had been unmade beneath the bridge's shadow. She did not go for Jin-Woo directly. She had learned enough, in 3 days of careful, furious study, to understand that a direct confrontation with the Shadow Monarch himself remained, for now, a losing proposition. Instead, she went for the seam in his defense that every observer of the last 3 days had quietly identified, and no one, not Hellsing, not Millennium, not even Jin-Woo himself, so far as her intelligence suggested, had yet found a way to properly close. He could not be everywhere, and where he was not, the people he had spent 3 days protecting remained, by simple necessity, considerably more vulnerable. The evacuation convoy moving through Southwark that evening carried some 60 civilians. The last significant group remaining in a borough Hellsing had been quietly clearing for 2 days. Families and elderly residents too frail or too stubborn to have left earlier, now finally being shepherded toward the safety of the western districts under a modest Hellsing escort. It was, in every particular, an unglamorous, quiet operation, the kind that drew no attention from either side of the war's larger, louder engagements. Zoran Blitz found it anyway, because finding precisely the targets no one thought to guard closely enough was, in its own dark way, her particular genius. She did not attack the convoy directly. She simply touched the lead driver's shoulder as he passed a narrow alley mouth, a brush of contact lasting less than a second, easily mistaken for an accidental collision in the crowded, hurried chaos of an evacuation, and let her illusion do the rest, twisting his perception so that the convoy's own escort became, in his fractured sightline, an approaching enemy formation. The driver panicked, the convoy scattered, and in the chaos that followed, Zoran's waiting chippers descended on a group of 60 frightened, disoriented civilians who no longer had any coherent defense standing between them and a deliberate, calculated slaughter designed for exactly one purpose: to reach Sung Jin-Woo through the one channel his restraint could not fully close. He felt it the way he had felt every previous crisis in this city: a pressure in the air, a wrongness in the pattern of a night that had, until that moment, carried the particular quiet of a lull rather than a battle. And he was moving before Hellsing's own communications had finished relaying the alarm. Beru and Egress already summoned, already streaking through Southwark's narrow streets at a speed that outpaced even the fastest of Hellsing's response vehicles. He was too far away. He understood this within the first 30 seconds of the run, the particular cold, sinking certainty of a man doing the arithmetic of distance and time, and finding the answer come back wrong, and something in his chest went very still and very cold, the old, familiar dread of every world he had ever fallen into where the people in front of him mattered more than his own limits, and his own limits had, for once, actually mattered. He arrived to find the convoy already broken, already scattered, already bleeding into the particular horror of a massacre in progress, and Zoran Blitz's chippers, 12 of them, moving through the chaos with the eager, practiced efficiency of soldiers who understood exactly how much damage they could do in the narrow window before reinforcements arrived. He did not think. He simply moved, and the violence that followed was unlike anything he had shown this world in 3 days of careful, considered restraint. Not the clean, economical efficiency of Lambeth Bridge, not the disciplined defensive line of the shelter at Camden, but something closer to the raw, unfiltered fury of a man who had, for the first time since falling into this city, arrived too late to prevent what he had spent 3 days promising himself he would always be fast enough to prevent. The chippers did not survive contact with him, not one, but the convoy's toll had already been taken in the seconds before his arrival, and when the violence finally stilled, when the last of Zoran's soldiers had been unmade, and the alley fell into the particular, ringing silence that follows any massacre's ending, Sung Jin-Woo stood amid the wreckage of an evacuation that had failed, and counted, with the flat, brutal clarity he had never fully escaped since his earliest days climbing, the cost of an ambush that had, quite deliberately, been aimed at the precise gap in his protection. 11 dead, 19 wounded, several critically, 40-some survivors, alive because he had arrived in time to end the slaughter, even if he had not arrived in time to prevent it from beginning. He knelt beside the body of a woman who could not have been older than 30, one arm still curled protectively around a child who had, against every terrible odd of the last several minutes, survived unharmed, and felt something in his chest crack open that he had not let crack in a very long time. Baru approached slowly, mandibles lowered in the particular posture the Ant King reserved for moments when even he understood that some griefs were not his to interrupt. "Jin-Woo, I know." His voice, when it came, was very quiet, very controlled, the particular controlled quiet of a man holding something enormous behind a wall that had, until tonight, never fully needed testing. "I know, Baru, I was too slow." "You were not slow. You were far away, and this was planned to exploit precisely that distance. This is not a failure of your strength. It doesn't matter what it's a failure of." Jin-Woo rose, looking down at the alley, at the wreckage of a convoy that had trusted, correctly, that this world's newest protector would come if called, and had paid for that trust regardless, because the call had come a handful of seconds too late. 11 people are dead, who wouldn't be, if I'd been faster, or smarter, or in the right place instead of the wrong one. That's not a technicality, Baru. That's the whole math. He stood there for a long moment, in the settling dark, in the particular silence that follows violence once the adrenaline of it has finally burned away, and left only the accounting behind, and something in him, watching the surviving child clutched now in a Hellsing medic's arms, hardened into a shape that had not existed in him 3 days earlier, when he had first walked out of a torn sky and decided, with the easy, uncomplicated certainty of a man who had not yet learned this particular war's specific cruelty, that he would simply stop as much of the dying as he could reach. Restraint, he thought, looking at the alley, at the 11 bodies, at the particular calculated precision with which Zoran Blitz had found and exploited the exact gap his own principles had left open. They're using my restraint against me. Every civilian I protect is another target they can use to bait me somewhere else. It was, he understood with a cold, settling clarity, exactly the lesson the Major had promised him 3 nights ago, standing in the ruined street at Camden with his teacup and his terrible, genuine delight. This was never truly about that shelter at all. It was an introduction. This, Southwark, the 11 dead, the calculated cruelty of an attack aimed precisely at the seam in his own principles. This was the second lesson, and Jin-Woo suspected, standing amid the wreckage with something old and cold settling behind his eyes, that it would not be the last. The report reached Integra Hellsing within the hour, and she received it in the war room with the particular, controlled fury of a commander who understood, immediately and completely, exactly what strategy had been deployed against her newest ally, and exactly what it meant for the shape of the war going forward. "They're not trying to defeat him in open combat," she said, to Walter, to the map table, to the particular cold understanding settling over the room. "They've realized they can't. So they're trying to break the thing that makes him useful to us in the first place. His restraint, his refusal to let anyone die that he might have saved. Every civilian we can't perfectly protect becomes a weapon Millennium can use against him. A cruel strategy, Walter said quietly, but not, I think, an unintelligent one. No. Integra's jaw tightened, cigar burning unattended in the ashtray beside her. It is precisely the kind of strategy that man would design, and take genuine pleasure in designing. She looked up, and something in her sharp blue eyes had hardened into a resolve that had not fully been present 3 days earlier, when she had first extended a cautious, provisional trust to an unknown power, fallen out of a tear in the sky. Walter, I want every remaining evacuation route in this city resecured, tonight, with proper escort, not the modest details we've been running. Full military coverage. I will not have this organization's carelessness handing Millennium another opportunity to exploit the one genuinely decent thing this war has produced in 3 days of horror. And Sung Jin-Woo, sir? Integra was quiet for a moment, looking toward the window, toward the direction of Southwark, where she understood, without needing to be told, that the young man who had spent 3 days holding himself to a standard this war had not asked him to meet was, right now, sitting with the weight of 11 deaths he had not caused and could not have entirely prevented, doing the particular, brutal arithmetic that soldiers do in the aftermath of every battle they did not fully win. Find him, she said finally, quietly, not to manage him, not to strategize with him. Just find him, Walter, and make sure he understands that 11 dead in Southwark tonight is not a verdict on his restraint. It is a verdict on an enemy, cruel enough to weaponize decency itself, and I will not have him internalize their strategy as his own failure. Her voice hardened, the grief giving way, as it always did in her, to something closer to resolve. And then help me plan precisely how this organization intends to make the major regret ever having conceived of that particular lesson. Alucard found him first, an hour before Walter's search party would have, in the same small parish church where Walter had once offered a grieving soldier the shape of an old, hard-won wisdom. Jin-Woo sat again on the broken altar steps, alone this time by his own choosing, Beru and the rest of his soldiers dismissed to stand watch at a distance that respected, without needing to be told, that some griefs required solitude to properly settle. You are doing the thing, Alucard said, without preamble, settling himself against the church's ruined doorframe, with the loose, unhurried ease of a creature who had never once in 5 centuries felt the need to knock before entering a conversation. The thing every soul does, after its first true failure, replaying the arithmetic, wondering which second, precisely, could have been spent differently. Is there a version of tonight where I don't do that? Jin-Woo did not look up from his own hands. 11 people, Alucard. I've killed things 1,000 times more dangerous than what did that to them, and I still wasn't fast enough. No, Alucard agreed, simply, without the false comfort a lesser creature might have reached for. There is no version of you that does not do this, little king. I have watched 5 centuries of soldiers, saints, and monsters arrive at precisely this moment, and I have learned there are only 2 kinds of beings who reach it. Those who let the weight break something in them, harden into cruelty, or collapse into uselessness, or simply stop caring, because caring costs too much to keep affording, and those who carry it forward anyway, heavier for the carrying, and keep doing the work regardless. His red eyes glinted in the dim, smoke-hazed light filtering through the church's shattered windows. I confess, I do not yet know which of those you will prove to be. I find I am rather invested in the answer. You sound like you've watched a lot of people fail this particular test. I have watched every kind of being this world produces fail it, at one time or another. Priests, kings, monsters, myself included. More times than I care to number across 500 years. Something in Alucard's voice shifted, quieter, older. The theatrical hunger stripped briefly away to reveal something closer to genuine, weary honesty. I was human once, little king. Difficult as that may be to credit, looking at what I've become. I fought a war of my own, long before Hellsing's chain ever found me, and I lost people in it. More people than 11. More times than I care to remember clearly. I did not carry that weight well, in the end. I let it break something in me, and what grew back in its place was considerably less merciful than what had been there before. He tilted his head, studying Jin-Woo with an expression that was, for once, entirely without its usual predatory amusement. I do not say this to frighten you. I say it because I think you deserve to hear, honestly, from something that has lived the failure of this exact test, precisely how much is actually at stake in how you answer it. Jin-Woo was quiet for a long moment, turning this over. What would you tell me then, if you could go back and tell yourself something, before you let it break you? Alucard's mouth curved, slow and genuinely rueful. I would tell myself that the grief is not the enemy, little king. The grief is proof the caring was real in the first place. It is what you do with the grief that decides what grows from it. Whether you let it curdle into something that stops caring so it cannot be hurt this way again, or whether you let it simply be what it is, heavy and true, and no reason at all to stop doing the work that caused it. He straightened, pushing off from the doorframe, coat settling around him with its usual liquid grace. The Major wishes you to internalize tonight as a verdict on your restraint. My master understands this, and sent Walter to tell you so, though I suspect I have arrived slightly ahead of him. A faint, genuine smile. Do not give the Major that particular victory, sung Jin-Woo. He has taken quite enough from this city already, without also claiming your conscience as spoils. He turned to go, pausing once more at the church's broken door. For what small comfort it may offer, I do not believe you are the kind who breaks, little king. I have watched 5 centuries of beings fail this test, and I have learned to recognize, fairly quickly, which ones will not. You sit here doing this arithmetic instead of already plotting your next act of vengeance against an enemy who deserves it. That is, I think, the entire difference that matters. Walter arrived not long after, found Jin-Woo in much the same posture, and did not repeat what Alucard had already said, choosing instead to simply sit beside him again in the particular, companionable silence that had, in 3 short days, become something like an unlikely friendship. Sir Integra wanted you to know, Walter said finally, that Southwark's evacuation routes are being resecured tonight, with full military escort. She does not intend to allow this organization's oversight to hand Millennium another such opportunity. That's good, Jin-Woo said, but it doesn't fix the actual problem, Walter. The Major's found the exact weakness in what I'm trying to do here. Every person I protect is a lever he can pull to get to me somewhere else. I can't be everywhere. I never could. But now they know that, and they're going to keep using it. Yes, Walter agreed, quietly, without flinching from the honesty of it. I suspect they will. War of this shape rarely offers a clean solution to a problem like that one, Mr. Sung. I wish I could tell you otherwise. Jin-Woo was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, something in his voice had shifted. Not the raw grief of an hour earlier, but something colder, more deliberate. The particular sound of a strategist beginning to solve a problem, rather than simply mourn it. Then I need to change the shape of the problem, he said. I've been fighting this war reactively, responding to whatever they throw at me, wherever it lands. That's exactly what let Southwark happen. I was too far away because I was waiting to be needed, instead of already being positioned where I'd be needed most. He looked up, something sharp and focused settling behind his eyes. I need better coverage, more eyes on more of this city at once, and I think... He paused, considering, turning an idea over with the careful, methodical attention of a man who had spent a decade learning to build solutions out of whatever tools a given world offered him. I think I've been underusing my own army. I've been keeping the bulk of my soldiers close, using them as an extension of my own presence rather than as an independent network. That's a mistake. Back home, I never fought a war this large with just myself and Baru and Igris up front. I used my whole army, spread across the whole battlefield, coordinated but independent. Walter watched this recalibration happen with quiet, genuine interest. You intend to disperse your forces across the city. I intend to build a net instead of standing in one place waiting to be the only thing that catches people. Jin-Woo rose from the altar steps, something in his posture straightening, the grief not gone but folded now into resolve, exactly the shape Alucard had hoped, without quite saying so, that it would take. I need to talk to Sir Hellsing. If I'm going to cover this city properly, I need to know every evacuation route, every shelter, every soft target Millennium's likely to go after next. And I need her intelligence network coordinating with my soldiers directly, not just with me. He glanced at Walter, something almost like the ghost of a genuine smile touching his mouth for the first time since Southwark. Tell her I'm coming, and tell her, he hesitated, briefly, before finishing, tell her I'm not going to let tonight be the last time this happens without a fight. But I need her organization's help to make sure of that. This isn't something I can solve by getting stronger. It's something I can only solve by getting smarter about how I use what I've already got. Walter's smile, when it came, was quiet and genuine. I believe, Mr. Sung, that is precisely the answer Sir Integra was hoping you would eventually reach on your own. Come. I suspect she will be considerably more pleased to see this version of you walk through her door than the one Alucard and I found sitting here an hour ago. The war room, when Jin-Woo arrived, held not just Integra and Walter but Alucard as well, arms folded against the far wall with an expression of quiet, satisfied anticipation, and Sarah's Victoria, freshly returned from her own patrol along the southern perimeter, standing a little uncertainly near the door, clearly unsure of her place in whatever conversation was about to unfold. Sung Jin-Woo, Integra said, straightening from the map table as he entered, something in her sharp blue eyes carrying more genuine warmth than the careful, measured caution of their first meeting 3 days earlier. Walter tells me you have a proposal. I do. He crossed to the table, looking down at the map, at the city's shelters, its evacuation routes, the dense clusters of red marking Millennium's known and suspected positions, and something in his posture had settled fully now into the particular focused clarity of a strategist committing to a plan. I've been fighting this war wrong for 3 days, Sir Hellsing. I've been trying to be everywhere myself, and that cost 11 people their lives tonight because I couldn't be. I want to fix that, not by getting stronger, by getting smarter about how I deploy what I already have. He laid out the plan as it had crystallized in the walk from the church, his shadow soldiers dispersed in coordinated cells across the city's most vulnerable points, linked not just to his own awareness but to Hellsing's intelligence network directly, so that any threat to any shelter, any convoy, any soft target Millennium might target, could summon a response within seconds rather than minutes. Integra listened without interrupting, her sharp eyes tracking the plan's shape across the map with the particular, focused attention of a commander recognizing genuine strategic value when it was offered to her. This would require a level of coordination and trust between your forces and mine that we have not yet established, she said when he'd finished. My soldiers are not accustomed to taking tactical direction from an army that answers to someone outside this organization's chain of command. Then we build that coordination, Jin-Woo said. Starting tonight, I'm not asking your soldiers to answer to me, Sir Hellsing. I'm asking for a shared intelligence picture, so my soldiers and yours can respond to the same threats without either of us discovering them too late. A faint, humorless smile. The Major's counting on the gaps between us. I'd like to stop giving him any. Integra studied him for a long moment, and then, for the first time since his arrival in her city, allowed herself something that was, unmistakably, a genuine smile. Small and sharp, and entirely without the careful diplomatic distance she'd maintained across 3 days of cautious, provisional alliance. "Walter," she said, "wake the senior staff. I want a full coordination briefing within the hour." She looked back at Jin-Woo, something like genuine respect settling into her expression. "You have my organization's full cooperation," sung Jin-Woo. "Let us go show the Major exactly what happens when the gap he was counting on closes." Across the room, Alucard's satisfied smile widened, and even Saris, still uncertain of her place, found herself smiling faintly at the sight of a war room that had, in the space of a single conversation, remade itself around a plan built not from vengeance, but from the hard, unglamorous determination of a man who had refused to let a single terrible night convince him to stop trying. The coordinated network held its first true test 3 nights later, and it held it beautifully. Millennium struck at 4 locations simultaneously that evening: a supply depot in Bermondsey, a makeshift hospital in Peckham, 2 separate evacuation convoys threading through the city's shrinking safe corridors, a deliberate, calculated attempt to fracture the new alliance's response capacity by presenting more targets than any single defender, however powerful, could reasonably answer alone. It did not work the way the Major had intended it to. Jin-Woo's shadow soldiers, dispersed now across the city in coordinated cells linked directly to Hellsing's intelligence network, answered each threat within minutes, rather than the agonized, too-late scramble that had cost Southwark 11 lives. Igris led a detachment to Bermondsey, meeting Millennium's raiding party with disciplined, knightly precision. Beru himself tore through the assault on Peckham's hospital with a fury that made clear, to any Millennium soldier unfortunate enough to survive the engagement to report on it, exactly how personally the Ant King had taken Southwark's failure. The 2 convoys, escorted now by joint Hellsing shadow patrols moving in genuine coordination rather than parallel isolation, reached their destinations with every soul aboard accounted for. Jin-Woo himself held back that night, at Integra's insistence and, more importantly, his own hard-won recognition that a commander who personally answered every threat was a commander who could still be baited, still be exhausted, still be led away from where he was actually needed by an enemy patient, enough to study his patterns. He remained instead at the war room, beside Integra and Walter, watching the night's engagements unfold across a map now dense with real-time reports, and felt something in his chest ease, very slightly, for the first time since Southwark. 4 targets, Integra said, watching the last of the night's reports come in, her voice carrying a note of genuine, hard-won satisfaction. 4 responses, all successful, all within response windows that would have been impossible 3 nights ago. "This is precisely the difference your restructuring was meant to produce," sung Jin-Woo. "It's not enough," Jin-Woo said, though there was less of the raw, grief-driven urgency in it now, replaced by the calmer, more methodical caution of a strategist who understood that one good night did not undo the lesson of a bad one. "The Major's not going to keep making the same mistake twice. He tested the gap in my coverage with Southwark. Tonight he tested whether closing that gap actually held under pressure. He's learning too, same as I am." "Yes," Walter said quietly, setting down the last of the night's field reports. "I suspect that is rather precisely what troubles Sir Integra and myself the most, Mr. Sung. A man who learns as quickly and as ruthlessly as the Major does not simply run out of new lessons to teach. He escalates. Tonight was, I think, merely his latest test, and I would be very surprised if he did not already have his next one prepared. regardless of how tonight's unfolded. He was, as it turned out, entirely correct, though the shape of the Major's next escalation arrived from a direction none of them had fully anticipated. Schrödinger found Jin-Woo alone on the estate's outer wall a little past midnight, 3 nights after the coordinated network's first successful test. A slight, cat-eared figure in a Millennium officer's uniform, perched with casual, unnerving ease on the wall's stone edge, as though he had simply always been there, unnoticed, unremarked, a fact rather than an intrusion. "You're new," Jin-Woo said, straightening from where he'd been resting against the wall, some instinct honed across a decade of dungeon clearing, recognizing, immediately, that whatever stood before him did not fit neatly into any category he'd yet catalogued in this world. "I am, and I am not," Schrödinger said, with the particular, unbothered cheer of something that had long since stopped finding its own existence strange. "I'm everywhere the Major needs me, Herr Shadow King, and nowhere at all, if I don't wish to be found. Rather useful, that. The Major thought you'd like to meet the one asset in his arsenal your coordinated little network can't actually account for." He tilted his head, ears twitching, studying Jin-Woo with open, curious interest. "You've built quite the clever web these last few nights. Very impressive. But a web only catches what touches its threads, ja? And I don't touch anything I don't wish to." Jin-Woo went very still, understanding immediately, with the particular cold clarity of a strategist recognizing a genuinely dangerous new variable, exactly what this meant for the careful coordination he'd spent 3 nights building. "You're a scout. One that can go anywhere without being tracked. Better than a scout." Schrödinger's grin widened, sharp and delighted. "I'm the gap in every net anyone's ever built, Herr Shadow King. The Major sent me to deliver a message, not to fight. I've no interest in testing my luck against an army that unmakes chippers as easily as yours does. The message is this." His grin sharpened further, the casual cheer giving way, just for a moment, to something colder, more deliberate. "The Major knows exactly how your network operates now. Every cell, every coordination point, every gap you've spent 3 nights carefully closing. He's not troubled by any of it. He finds it, in fact, rather charming, the same way a chess master finds a clever opening charming, right before he shows you precisely why it doesn't win the game." He hopped down from the wall's edge, straightening his uniform with an idle, unbothered motion. "He asked me to tell you. The Letztes Bataillon has not yet been fully deployed in this war. Not once. Not even close. Everything you've fought so far has been reconnaissance, Herr Shadow King. Probes, tests, the opening moves of a much longer game. He thought you deserved to know that, before the real invitation arrives." "When?" "Soon." Schrödinger's grin returned, cheerful and untroubled. "He wanted you to have time to prepare. He finds unprepared opponents considerably less entertaining than ready ones." He glanced up at the smoke-hazed sky, ears twitching. Already, Jin-Woo understood, preparing to vanish as easily and as untraceably as he'd arrived. "Oh, and one more thing, Herr Shadow King. Since I find myself rather liking you, against my better professional judgment, the Major's real plan was never simply to test your restraint, or your coverage, or your network. Those were all just appetizers, ja? The full deployment of the Letztes Bataillon is meant to answer one question, and one question only: whether an army built from an entire world's worth of the greatest soldiers who ever died in war can be broken by anything a single man, however powerful, can bring against it." His grin widened, genuinely curious now, genuinely delighted by the shape of the coming test. "I confess, I'm rather looking forward to finding out the answer myself." And then, with no more warning than his arrival had offered, he was simply gone, vanished from the wall's edge as completely and untraceably as though he had never stood there at all, leaving Jin-Woo alone once more beneath a sky still hazed with the accumulated smoke of 8 days of war. turning over, with cold, careful focus, exactly what kind of storm was now, by the Major's own deliberate warning, finally about to break. He relayed the warning to Integra within the hour, and found her, when he did, already deep in a briefing with Walter and a haggard-looking intelligence officer, whose own reports, it transpired, had begun independently corroborating exactly what Schrödinger had come to deliver in person. Millennium's Zeppelins have begun consolidating, the officer reported, gesturing at a fresh set of aerial reconnaissance photographs spread across the war table. All of them, sir. Every unit we've tracked, scattered across the city these past 8 days, is converging on a single staging position east of the financial district. If they intend a full, coordinated deployment, this is the shape it would take. How long? Integra asked. Our best estimate, 2 days, perhaps 3. Integra absorbed this with the flat, controlled focus of a commander receiving exactly the news she had, on some level, been steeling herself to hear since the war's first burning night. Then we have 2 days, perhaps 3, to prepare for whatever the Major considers his true opening act, after 8 days of what he apparently regards as mere reconnaissance. She looked up, meeting Jin-Woo's eyes across the table, something grim and resolved settling into her sharp, weary features. I confess, son Jin-Woo, I had hoped this war's true climax lay somewhat further in the future than 2 days from now. It seems the Major has decided otherwise. Then we use the 2 days, Jin-Woo said. Everything we've built, the network, the coordination, the trust between your soldiers and mine. We use every hour we've got left to make sure it's actually ready for whatever's coming, instead of just ready for what's already happened. He looked down at the map, at the dense cluster of Millennium positions consolidating east of the financial district, and felt something in him settle into the particular, focused calm that had carried him through every genuine crisis of his climbing years. Not fear, not quite, but the cold, clear-eyed readiness of a man who understood, precisely, the size of the fight now bearing down on him, and had decided, just as precisely, that he would meet it standing, rather than waiting for it to arrive on someone else's terms. Alucard, entering the war room in time to catch the tail end of the briefing, allowed himself a slow, genuinely delighted smile. 2 days, he murmured, red eyes glinting with an anticipation he made no effort at all to hide. I confess, little king, I have waited 5 centuries for a war worth genuinely savoring. I begin to suspect the Major is finally about to give me one. Outside, beyond the estate's ancient walls, the smoke-hazed London night stretched on, quiet for now, deceptively still, the particular held-breath quiet of a city that did not yet know how thoroughly its remaining calm was about to be spent, in the 2 short days before the Battle of London's true climax finally, fully arrived. The 2 days that followed were, in their own quiet way, some of the strangest of Sung Jin-Woo's long, strange decade of climbing through worlds that had never once asked for his presence, because for the first time since falling through the tear over Vauxhall, he was not fighting. He was building. He spent the first day walking the length of Hellsing's coordination network in person, cell by cell, meeting the soldiers, human and otherwise, who would be standing beside his own shadow army when the Major's true offensive finally broke. He met Captain Rowe again, properly this time, no longer mid-retreat but steady and grateful and quietly, fiercely loyal to the man who had held his line at Lambeth Bridge. He met junior officers who had spent 8 days watching violet-black soldiers rise from London's own shadowed gutters, and had, slowly, stopped flinching at the sight of them. He met, at Integra's quiet insistence, the handful of surviving Southwark evacuees still recovering in Hellsing's makeshift infirmary, the child who had survived unharmed beneath his mother's last, protective embrace chief among them, and sat with them for a while, saying little, simply present, Because Walter had taught him, in a broken church 3 nights earlier, that some griefs needed witnessing more than they needed words. He spent the second day with Beru and Igris and the full weight of his summoned army, running coordination drills alongside Hellsing's forces with the same disciplined, exhaustive thoroughness he had once brought to preparing for S-rank dungeon raids back home, because the Major's warning had been clear, and Jin-Woo had learned, across a decade of climbing, that the only proper answer to a warned catastrophe was preparation thorough enough to meet it without flinching. Alucard joined the drills on the second afternoon, uninvited, and found himself, to his own evident and genuine surprise, enjoying the exercise considerably more than he had expected to. "You fight differently than I anticipated," he observed, watching Jin-Woo coordinate a mock engagement between shadow soldiers and Hellsing regulars, with the quiet, precise authority of a general who had commanded far larger and far stranger wars than this one. "I expected raw power, deployed without much art behind it. This," he gestured at the disciplined, layered coordination unfolding across the estate's training grounds. "This is craft. I confess, I did not expect craft from something that fell out of the sky 8 days ago, wielding an army of the dead." "I spent 10 years learning this," Jin-Woo said, without looking away from the drill. "Power without discipline just gets people killed faster. I learned that the hard way, more than once. As did I, in my own time." Alucard's red eyes glinted, something almost fond in the look. "I begin to suspect, little king, that you and I are considerably more alike than either of us expected. When I first found you standing in a burning street 8 nights ago," he straightened, coat settling around him. "The Major's Letztes Bataillon numbers in the thousands, and every soldier in it has already died once, and found the dying insufficient to stop them. I do not say this to frighten you. I say it because I think you deserve an honest accounting of precisely what you are about to face, from something that has fought this particular war considerably longer than you have." "I've fought armies before," Jin-Woo said. "Bigger than mine, worse than this one, in some ways." He turned, finally, to meet Alucard's gaze directly. "But I've never fought one standing next to allies who actually trust me. That's new. I think it might matter more than the numbers." Something in Alucard's expression shifted at that. Not quite surprise, but the particular, genuine consideration of a 500-year-old creature encountering, against considerable odds, a sentiment he had not expected to find himself agreeing with quite so completely. "Yes," he said finally, quietly. "I rather think it might, at that." On the evening of the second day, as the last light finally failed over a city still smoke-hazed from 8 days of war, Integra Hellsing called what would prove to be the final council before the Major's offensive broke. Not the formal, tense negotiation of their first meeting, but something closer to what an actual alliance, hard-won across 8 days of shared crisis, was finally beginning to resemble. Alucard and Saras stood at one side of the war room, Walter at Integra's shoulder, as ever. Jin-Woo, Beru, and Igris across from them, the strange, unlikely shape of a coalition that 8 days ago none of them would have believed possible, now settled into something that functioned, in its rough, hard-won way, like genuine trust. "Our reconnaissance confirms Schrodinger's warning," Integra said, laying out the final intelligence across the map table. "The Letztes Bataillon's full strength is consolidating for a single, coordinated assault on the city's remaining defensive core. This estate, the Round Table's bunker beneath Whitehall, and the last significant civilian shelters still holding in the western districts. The Major intends, by every indication we've gathered, to end this war in a single night, with a single overwhelming blow. Then we don't let him," Jin-Woo said simply. "No," Integra agreed, something grim and resolved in her sharp, tired eyes. "We do not." She looked around the room, at Alucard's fierce, hungry readiness, at Saras's quiet, determined courage, at Walter's calm, unshakable steadiness, at the strange, powerful ally who had fallen out of a torn sky 8 nights ago and had, in the days since, become something closer to genuine family than either she or he had expected, and allowed herself, for just a moment, something that was almost hope. "Tomorrow," she said, "or the day after, or whenever the Major finally judges his masterpiece ready, London will face the single largest coordinated assault in this war's entire history. I will not pretend to you that the odds are comfortable ones, but I have watched, these past 8 days, what this alliance is capable of when it fights as one force, rather than 3 fractured factions circling the same burning city." Her voice steadied, hardened, carrying across the room with the particular authority that had, across a decade of command, earned her the loyalty of everyone standing in it. "We will meet the Major's masterpiece with one of our own, and we will show him, once and for all, precisely what happens when the thing he built his entire war to test finally, fully, answers the question he spent 8 days asking." Outside, beyond the estate's ancient walls, the last of the second day's light finally failed completely, and London settled into the particular held-breath darkness of a city standing on the edge of whatever came next, while far to the east, in a requisitioned bank overlooking a staging ground, now dense with the assembled, undying ranks of the Letztes Bataillon, the Major raised his teacup to a window full of gathering thunderheads, and smiled the wide, genuine, terrible smile of a man who believed, with everything he was, that he had finally found the single greatest night of a 50-year war. It began, as the Major had always intended it to, with theater. The sky above London on the 9th night of the Battle of London did not merely fill with zeppelins, it became zeppelins, an armada so vast and so total that the last thin stars still struggling through the city's accumulated smoke vanished entirely behind a canopy of black steel, engines droning in a low, continuous thunder that London's older residents would later swear they felt in their teeth before they ever heard it in their ears. From the bellies of that armada, in numbers that made the previous 8 nights of fighting look, in grim retrospect, like the opening skirmish it had always been, the full strength of the Letztes Bataillon began its descent. Thousands of them, soldiers plucked from 100 wars across 100 years of human cruelty, given eternal purpose and undying flesh by the Major's 50 years of patient, monstrous science, descending now on London's remaining defensive positions with the disciplined, terrible precision of an army that had never, in all its long unlife, been asked to fight at anything less than its absolute full strength. At the head of it all, in an open command vehicle that offered no cover because its occupant required none, the Major sipped his tea and watched his masterpiece unfold across the burning sky, with the particular, uncomplicated joy of an artist finally witnessing the completion of a lifetime's work. "Beautiful," he murmured, and this time there was no one nearby to hear him say it, and he did not care in the slightest. 50 years, and here it finally is. Sung Jin-Woo felt the offensive begin before Hellsing's own alarm systems had finished processing the scale of it. A pressure in the air unlike anything the previous 8 nights had offered. Vast and total, and utterly without the testing, probing quality of everything that had come before. This was not reconnaissance. This was not a lesson dressed in violence, designed to teach him some particular truth about restraint or coverage, or the gaps in his own protective instincts. This was, finally, the war itself, arriving in full. "Now," he said, and did not need to say more. Beru and Igris were already moving, already summoning the full weight of his army into a defensive formation that had been drilled and refined across 2 days of careful preparation, and across the city, in cells now coordinated with Hellsing's own forces in a network built specifically to answer exactly this kind of overwhelming coordinated assault. The response began. It held, for the first several hours, With a discipline that surprised even Jin-Woo himself, the network he had built in the aftermath of Southwark's grief did precisely what it had been designed to do: closing gaps, coordinating responses, ensuring that no single shelter, no single convoy, no single soft target went undefended for the fatal handful of seconds that had cost 11 lives 8 nights earlier. Igris held the eastern approach to the Round Table's bunker with a discipline that made even Millennium's most seasoned officers pause, briefly, in genuine tactical respect before committing everything they had to breaking his line regardless. Beru tore through wave after wave of the Letztes Bataillon's forward ranks with a fury that had not fully cooled since Southwark, each kill a small, silent accounting against a debt he had taken, in his own way, every bit as personally as Jin-Woo had. Alucard fought that night with an abandon London's people had never quite seen from him, even across 200 years of Hellsing service. Not the cold, efficient violence of routine duty, but something closer to genuine, ancient joy, the ecstatic release of a 500-year-old predator, finally offered a war worthy of the whole of his considerable terrible appetite. Saris fought beside him with a courage that had grown, across 8 hard nights, into something approaching her master's own fearlessness. The Harkonnen's massive rounds tearing gaps in the Letztes Battalion's advancing ranks, that Alucard's own familiars widened into ruin, and Integra Hellsing, in the war room beneath her family's estate, coordinated the whole of it. Hellsing's forces, Jin-Woo's network, the desperate, overlapping defense of a city fighting for its life, with the particular, unbreakable focus of a commander who had spent her entire adult life preparing, without fully knowing it, for precisely this night. For nearly 4 hours, the line held. Then Zoran Blitz, given her own particular orders by a major who understood, better than almost anyone in this war, exactly which threads to pull to unravel even the most carefully constructed defense, found the one gap that mattered. She did not go for a shelter this time. She had learned in the aftermath of Southwark that the coordination network had closed that particular avenue too thoroughly to exploit again. Instead, she went for something considerably more direct: the physical seam between Hellsing's forces and Jin-Woo's own soldiers, the narrow, imperfect junction where 2 different armies, built on 2 entirely different principles, coordinated their defense of the Round Table's bunker beneath Whitehall. It should not have worked. 8 days of careful drilling had, in theory, closed even that particular gap. But Zoran Blitz's genius had never been in finding weaknesses that existed in isolation. It had been in finding the precise moment, amid the chaos of a genuinely overwhelming assault, when even the most careful coordination frayed under sheer, exhausting pressure, and in that fraying instant, striking with a precision that turned momentary confusion into catastrophic collapse. She touched a Hellsing captain's shoulder in the chaos of the bunker's eastern approach, and his perception twisted, and for 3 critical seconds, his own soldiers and Jin-Woo's own shadow cell at that position each believed, in the horrible, fractured logic of her illusion, that the other was the enemy. 3 seconds, in a battle of this scale, against an army of thousands, was more than enough. The Letztes Bataillon's forward elements poured through the resulting gap with the disciplined, ruthless speed of soldiers who had been specifically positioned to exploit exactly this kind of opportunity, and within minutes, the Round Table's bunker, the seat of Britain's entire remaining secret command structure, 12 of the most powerful men in the country sheltering within it, found itself facing a breach that no amount of careful coordination could fully close in time. Jin-Woo felt the collapse the moment it began, a sudden, violent shift in the network's coherence, the particular, sickening sensation of a carefully built structure fracturing under pressure it had, until this exact moment, been holding successfully against, and he was moving before the full report had even finished reaching him, faster than he had moved in 8 days of careful, disciplined restraint, faster than he had moved in 8 Southwark, because this time he understood with a cold, driving clarity he could not afford to arrive even a single second late. He reached the bunker's breached perimeter to find a scene of controlled, desperate chaos. Hellsing soldiers and his own shadow cell fighting side by side once more. The illusion's fracturing perception finally broken by the simple, brutal clarity of actual combat. But the gap already torn too wide. The Letztes Bataillon's forward elements, already pressing toward the bunker's inner sanctum, with a speed and determination that made clear exactly how deliberately this breach had been engineered. Beru, Igris, to me. His voice carried across the chaos, with an authority that cut through even the battle's overwhelming noise, and his soldiers answered, converging on the breach with a speed that finally, decisively, began closing the gap Zoran's illusion had torn open, but not before a smaller, faster contingent of the Bataillon's most elite soldiers had already slipped past the collapsing perimeter, driving directly toward the bunker's lower levels, toward the round table itself. Jin-Woo made the calculation in less than a second, the same brutal, familiar arithmetic he had made too many times in too many worlds, weighing what he could reach against what he could not, and finding, this time, with a fierce, driving determination that had not been present 8 nights ago in a Southwark alley, that he refused to accept the same answer twice. "Hold the perimeter," he said to Beru, already moving. "I'm going after them myself." He caught the elite contingent 3 levels down, in a narrow stone corridor that offered no room for the kind of large-scale devastation his shadow army specialized in, and found himself, for the first time since arriving in this world, fighting entirely alone against soldiers who had been specifically selected, specifically trained, for exactly this kind of close-quarters, high-stakes engagement. It was, he would reflect later, the hardest fight London's war had yet offered him, not because the soldiers themselves matched his own raw power, but because the stakes of failure, in that narrow corridor, admitted no margin at all. Behind him, deeper in the bunker, 12 men who held the fate of Britain's entire secret defense structure waited, unarmed, unprepared, entirely dependent on a single exhausted stranger from another world, standing between them and an army that did not know the meaning of retreat. He fought them the way he had fought the very worst dungeons of his climbing years, with a focus so total it left no room for anything else, no fear, no fatigue, no thought beyond the next strike and the one after it. And when the corridor finally fell silent, when the last of the elite contingent had been unmade against a defense that had refused, absolutely, to yield even a single additional foot of ground, Sung Jin-Woo stood alone in the narrow stone passage, breathing hard for the first time in 8 days of otherwise effortless combat, and understood, with a fierce, quiet satisfaction, that this time, this one time, when it had mattered most, he had been fast enough. Above him, the wider battle raged on toward what would prove to be its longest, hardest night, the true climax of a war that had, across 9 days, grown from a single burning city into something considerably larger and stranger than anyone, Hellsing or Millennium, or the fallen king of shadows himself, had ever quite anticipated. But in the narrow corridor beneath Whitehall, in the particular, ringing silence of a fight won by the narrowest and most hard-fought of margins, Jin-Woo allowed himself, just for a moment, the quiet, fierce relief of a debt finally, properly repaid. The Major's masterpiece had found its first true test that night, and had, against every expectation the man himself had carried into the battle, been met, not defeated outright, not yet, but met, held, answered with a resolve that surprised even the alliance that had built it. The night, however, was very far from finished, and somewhere above, in a command vehicle overlooking the whole of the battle's chaos, The Major set down his teacup at last, and considered, with the particular, focused interest of an artist, recognizing that his masterpiece required considerably more than one movement to reach its true conclusion, precisely what act he intended to stage next. The Major watched the round table's breach fail to deliver its intended result, with the particular, genuine delight of a man who had, across 50 years of careful preparation, learned to find real joy in an opponent's competence, even, especially, when that competence cost him a favored gambit. "Well," he said, to the doctor, to the assembled bank of instruments, still tracking the battle's chaotic progress across a dozen simultaneous fronts. "It seems our Shadow King has learned to close his gaps rather more quickly than I anticipated. How very disappointing." His smile, entirely at odds with the words, widened into something closer to genuine anticipation. "I suppose there is nothing left to it then, but to stop testing him piecemeal, and simply ask the question outright." "You intend to engage him personally," the doctor said. "Not quite a question. I have wanted to since the very first night, Doctor. Every test since has simply been the patient accumulation of an artist's proper preparation." The Major set down his teacup, for the last time that night, though neither he nor anyone watching yet knew it, and rose from his command vehicle with the loose, unhurried ease of a man about to enjoy, finally, the single evening he had spent 50 years building toward. "Bring the reserve, all of it. I believe it is time our new friend understood, in full, precisely what 50 years of careful work looks like when it finally stops holding back." Jin-Woo felt the shift in the battle's texture the moment the Major's reserve committed, a vast, sudden surge in the density and coordination of the Letztes Bataillon's remaining ranks, converging now from every direction on a single point, with a purpose that made clear, immediately, exactly who intended to be waiting at the center of that convergence. He met the Major on the wide, ruined avenue outside the financial district's shattered exchange buildings. The same theatrical stage the man had clearly chosen with the same deliberate care he brought to every act of this long, terrible war. A broad, open space, cleared now of the Letztes Bataillon's own advancing ranks, offering room enough for a confrontation neither side intended, any longer, to soften with the pretense of restraint. "There you are," the Major said, standing alone at the avenue's center. No command vehicle now, no teacup, only the wide, genuine smile of a man who had waited 50 years and 9 days for precisely this moment. "I confess, Mr. Sung, I have grown rather tired of testing you through proxies. I find I would very much prefer to finish this conversation myself." "Then let's finish it." Jin-Woo's voice carried none of the exhaustion of the night's earlier fighting, only the flat, focused readiness of a man who had spent 9 days learning exactly what this enemy was capable of, and had decided, finally, that understanding was no longer sufficient. Tonight required ending. The Major's smile widened, delighted, direct as ever. "Very well." He raised one hand, and the ground around him, not shadow, not any mechanism Jin-Woo had yet catalogued in this world, but something closer to raw, undisciplined vampiric power, unleashed without restraint for the first time in the entire war, began to churn, dark and violent, and from it, the Major's own true strength finally, fully emerged. It was, Jin-Woo understood within the first several seconds of the engagement, considerably more than the jovial, teacup-sipping theater of their previous conversations had prepared him for. The Major's body twisted, expanded, becoming something closer to a living engine of war than any recognizable human shape, vast and armored and radiating a raw destructive power that made even Baru, arriving at speed to flank the engagement, hesitate for one genuinely startled instant before committing fully to the fight. 50 years, the Major said, his voice now carrying a resonance that shook the ruined avenue's remaining windows. "I spent building an army that could not be broken, and you, Mr. Sung, You are the first opponent in the whole of that 50 years who has made me genuinely wonder whether my masterpiece required a rather more personal final movement. The vast, engine-like form surged forward, and the avenue itself buckled under the force of the charge. Show me then. Show me precisely what a Shadow Monarch's full strength actually looks like, unleashed at last against an opponent worthy of it. Jin-Woo did not answer with words. He answered by finally, fully committing the whole of his authority, the whole of his army, the whole of 10 years' hard-won mastery brought to bear in a single, overwhelming response that turned the ruined avenue into a battlefield, the likes of which London's long, violent history had never once witnessed. Shadow met vampiric fury in a clash that lit the smoke-choked sky brighter than any of the Letztes Batallion's fires had managed across the whole of the war's 9 nights. Beru fought at Jin-Woo's flank with a raw, furious dedication that spoke to every ounce of loyalty the Ant King had accumulated across their long partnership. Igris, arriving moments later, added his own disciplined blade to the engagement, driving precise, calculated strikes against an opponent whose raw power dwarfed anything London's war had yet produced. And the Major, for all his genuine, delighted relish in the fight, began, within minutes, to understand, with the particular, clear-eyed honesty of a strategist who had never once let his own theater blind him to an accurate battlefield assessment, that he had, at last, found an opponent whose full strength genuinely exceeded his own. Magnificent, he said, even as Jin-Woo's shadow-forged strikes began, steadily, relentlessly, to overwhelm his own vast engine-like defense, even as Beru's fury and Igris's precision closed around him in a coordinated assault that no amount of raw power alone could fully answer. Absolutely magnificent. 50 years, and I finally understand what true, unbound power actually looks like. His vast form staggered under a combined strike that would have ended a lesser being outright, and something in his ruined, twisted expression, for just a moment, beneath the theater, beneath the genuine delight, carried the honest, unhidden acknowledgement of a man watching his own masterpiece, at long last, reach the limit of what it could achieve. I do believe, Mr. Sung, that you have finally answered the question I built this entire war to ask. The Major did not die easily, and he did not die without one final, genuine act of the theater that had defined his entire long, monstrous existence. But when the end finally came, in the shattered center of the avenue his own masterpiece had chosen as its final stage, it came with a strange, unexpected grace, the Major's vast form finally collapsing back into something closer to human shape, his wide smile, impossibly, still present even in the last moments of an existence that had spanned 50 years of careful, monstrous preparation for precisely this ending. Tell me, he said, very quietly, to Jin-Woo, as the last of his strength finally failed. Was it worth it, do you think? Building an army from the dead, carrying that weight across every world you've ever fallen into, simply to keep doing this exhausting, thankless work of standing between catastrophe and the people too weak to stand against it themselves. Jin-Woo looked down at him, at the strange, genuine curiosity in a dying man's final question, and found, despite everything, an honest answer waiting. Yes, he said simply. Every time, the Major's smile, in the very last instant before it finally, fully faded, carried something that was almost, impossibly, after everything, respect. Then I suppose, he said, my masterpiece found its proper ending after all. And then he was gone, and the vast engine of the Letztes Bataillon, its commanding will and animating purpose, suddenly, catastrophically severed, began, across the whole of London's ruined battlefield, to falter. Soldiers who had fought with disciplined, undying purpose for 9 long nights suddenly, finally, losing the singular will that had bound 50 years of careful, monstrous science into a coherent, terrible whole. The Battle of London did not end all at once. Wars of this scale rarely do. But in the hours that followed the Major's fall, as word spread across the city's remaining defensive positions that the architect of Millennium's invasion had finally been answered, the tide that had held, agonizingly, precarious for 9 full nights finally, decisively, began to turn. Alucard felt it first, across the city, in the particular shift of a battlefield's fundamental texture that only a creature of his considerable age and experience could properly register. The Letztes Bataillon's disciplined ranks fracturing, faltering, the singular purpose that had animated them for 50 years suddenly, finally, unmade. "Well now," he murmured, to Saris, to the burning city around them both, to the whole of a war he had genuinely, honestly enjoyed for the first time in longer than he cared to admit. "I do believe our Shadow King has finally answered the Major's question rather more decisively than the man himself expected." Integra Hellsing, in the war room beneath her family's estate, watched the tide turn across her map table with a fierce, exhausted relief that she allowed herself, for the first time in 9 days, to fully feel. "Walter," she said, her voice carrying, for the first time since the invasion began, something genuinely close to hope. "Send word to every remaining position. The Major is dead. Millennium's command is broken. I want this city's remaining defenders to know exactly what that means, and I want every available resource redirected to finishing what 9 nights of holding the line has finally earned us the chance to finish." Walter's smile, quiet and genuine, carried the particular, hard-won satisfaction of an old soldier who had watched, across 50 years of service to this family, more wars than he cared to count, and had rarely been given the chance to watch one turn, finally, decisively, toward something like victory. "At once, sir," he said, and moved to carry out her orders with the same careful, precise efficiency he brought to everything, while outside, across the whole of a city that had burned for 9 long nights, the first genuine, unforced silence in longer than anyone could properly remember began, slowly, uncertainly, to settle over London's ruined streets. The days that followed the Major's fall did not resemble victory so much as they resembled the slow, grinding work of survival, the particular, unglamorous labor of a city learning to breathe again after 9 nights of holding its breath against annihilation. The Letztes Bataillon's remaining ranks, stripped of the singular will that had bound them into a coherent army, scattered into isolated pockets of resistance that Hellsing's forces, working now in close, practiced coordination with Jin-Woo's own soldiers, spent the better part of a week methodically dismantling. Zoran Blitz was found, 3 days after the Major's death, in the ruins of a Bermondsey warehouse, and the engagement that ended her long, calculated cruelty was, by every account Jin-Woo received afterward, considerably shorter than the reckoning her illusions had earned across 9 nights of exploited grief. Rip Van Winkle, true to the particular, professional grace she had brought to every engagement, laid down her rifle without further violence, once the Major's fall made clear that the war she had died once already fighting had, at last, genuinely ended, and surrendered herself, with quiet dignity, into Hellsing's custody. The doctor was never found. Some among Hellsing's intelligence staff speculated he had died in the collapse of Millennium's command structure. Others, more cautious, suggested a mind capable of the science that had built the Letztes Bataillon in the first place was unlikely to have vanished quite so cleanly. Integra ordered the search continued, quietly, without urgency, and did not speak of it again in Jin-Woo's presence. Enrico Maxwell, for his part, adapted to Millennium's defeat with the same oily, calculating grace he brought to every reversal of fortune. Arriving at the Hellsing estate less than a week after the Major's fall to offer, with a smile that fooled no one in the room. His church's warm congratulations on London's survival, and his renewed, entirely undiminished interest in securing an arrangement with the war's genuinely decisive new asset. "I believe I gave you my answer 9 days ago, Your Excellency," Jin-Woo said, with the particular flat patience of a man who had, across the war's grinding length, learned exactly how little Maxwell's persistence was going to be worn down by simple refusal. "You did," Maxwell agreed, his smile not wavering in the slightest. "And I confess, Mr. Sung, I have come to rather admire the consistency of it, whatever my own ambitions might prefer otherwise. Section 13 does not forget a decisive victory, nor the man who won it. Should you ever find yourself in need of an ally the Hellsing organization cannot provide, I trust you'll remember that the Vatican's door, unlike certain other doors in this affair, remains genuinely open." He inclined his head, with a courtesy that carried, beneath its careful theater, something that might, in a man less practiced at concealment, have resembled genuine respect. "Until then, I do hope London's peace proves more durable than its war, for all our sakes." Father Anderson, who had accompanied the delegation without any evident enthusiasm for its diplomatic purpose, lingered a moment after Maxwell's departure, his manic grin, for once, tempered by something quieter. "You did well, lad," he said, simply. "Better than well. I've hunted more monsters than I care to number in this long, violent service of mine, and I've met precious few genuine heroes among the lot of them, this city's or any others. I'd count you among that rarer number, for whatever an old priest's opinion happens to be worth." He offered a rough, genuine nod, and turned to follow Maxwell's retreating delegation, pausing once more at the estate's gate to call back, with something of his old, cheerful menace fully restored. "Do try to find your way home safely, whenever that door finally opens for you. I'd rather hate to have to hunt you down properly, should you turn out to be the kind of monster after all." The door, when it finally did open, arrived without ceremony, on a quiet, gray morning some 3 weeks after the Major's fall, in the same small, still-recovering parish church where Jin-Woo had first begun to properly understand the weight of the war he'd fallen into. He felt it the way he had felt every genuine shift in this world's fabric since his arrival, a particular, familiar pressure in the air, the unmistakable texture of a passage between worlds finally, after weeks of careful, patient searching by both Hellsing's occult specialists and Jin-Woo's own tireless efforts to understand the mechanism that had brought him here in the first place, opening once more. Integra found him there within the hour, summoned by Walter's own careful attention to the particular quality of the morning's strange gathering light, and stood for a long moment in the church's ruined doorway, watching a young man from another world study a tear in the fabric of reality, with the same calm, focused attention he had brought to every crisis of the last 3 weeks. "It's stable," Jin-Woo said, without turning. "For now, at least. I don't know how long it'll stay open." "Then, I imagine," Integra said, crossing to stand beside him, "you don't have very much time to decide." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the door, at the promise of home, of his own world, of the people who had spent weeks, by his own reckoning, not knowing whether he was alive or lost forever in some catastrophe they couldn't imagine. And then, slowly, he turned to look at her instead, at the war room commander who had extended him, on their very first meeting, a trust she'd had no real reason to offer, and every reason to withhold. "I have to go back," he said. "There are people waiting for me. People who need me there, the same way this city needed me here." A faint, genuine smile touched his mouth. "But I wanted you to know, these 3 weeks, they mattered, more than I think I fully understood, until right now, standing in front of the door home, and realizing how much I'm actually going to miss this place." Integra studied him for a long moment, something unguarded, genuinely warm, settling into her sharp, tired features, an expression Jin-Woo suspected very few people in this world had ever been permitted to see. "You arrived in the middle of the worst night this city has faced in 200 years, she said. "And you spent every day since giving more of yourself to strangers, who had no claim on you at all, than most soldiers give in a lifetime of service to a cause they were born into. I do not know how this world's history will remember what happened here," sung Jin-Woo, "or whether it will remember you at all, once the official reports are filed and the classified files sealed. But I will remember. And I suspect every soul in this city who is alive this morning because of what you chose to do here will remember, whether they ever learn your name or not." She extended a hand, the gesture carrying more weight than its simplicity suggested. "Go home. Your people need you. But know that you have earned, in this city, considerably more than a temporary alliance. You have earned a debt this organization does not intend to forget." He took her hand and shook it, and found himself, unexpectedly, genuinely moved by the simple, unadorned honesty of the gesture. Alucard arrived as the church's small gathering finished its farewells. Walter's quiet, genuine handshake, Ceres's earnest, slightly tearful goodbye. Beru and Igris dismissed back to whatever quiet place his authority kept them between calls, and studied the tear in reality, with the particular, ancient curiosity of a creature who had genuinely, rarely, in 500 years, found something worth calling new. "So," he said, "the little king finally goes home." "Finally," Jin-Woo agreed. "I confess, I shall miss you," sung Jin-Woo. Alucard's smile, for once, carried nothing of its usual predatory theater, only something quieter, more genuine, the honest fondness of an old monster who had found, against every reasonable expectation, something worth respecting in this world's newest and strangest visitor. "It has been a very long time since anything in this world offered me a fight worth savoring, or a conversation worth genuinely having. I find I am considerably poorer for your leaving, whatever poverty a creature as old as myself is still capable of feeling." "You could visit," Jin-Woo said, with a faint, wry smile. "If you ever figure out how." "Perhaps I shall." Alucard's grin returned, sharp and genuine. 500 years is a very long time to spend without a proper rival, little king. I find myself rather unwilling to let this particular one simply vanish from my long, tedious existence without at least the possibility of a rematch, someday, on ground of our mutual choosing. He inclined his head, a gesture of genuine, hard-won respect from a creature who rarely offered such things freely. "Go well," sung Jin-Woo. "This world is considerably better for having briefly held you in it." Jin-Woo looked at them all once more. Integra's steady, resolute strength, Walter's quiet wisdom, Ceres's earnest courage, Alucard's ancient, genuine respect, and felt, standing at the threshold of a door that would carry him home, the particular, bittersweet weight of a debt he suspected he would carry, in his own quiet way, for the whole of his long life. "Thank you," he said simply, to all of them, and meant it more completely than any 3 words had managed to carry in longer than he could remember. "For trusting me, for fighting beside me, for teaching me something about this kind of war I don't think I would have learned anywhere else." And then, before the door could close, before the strange, fragile passage between worlds could seal itself once more and strand him permanently in a city that had, against every reasonable expectation, become something like a second home across 3 short weeks of fire and grief and hard-won, genuine trust, Sung Jin-Woo stepped through, and the tear in reality closed quietly behind him, and London's long war, at last, was finally over. London rebuilt slowly, the way cities always do, not in the dramatic sweeping strokes of legend, but in the patient, unglamorous accumulation of ordinary days. Streets cleared, buildings raised, Families who had sheltered in church basements and underground stations finally returning to homes that would take years, in some cases, to feel whole again. The official history, when it was finally written, credited the Hellsing organization's tireless defense and the timely intervention of unspecified additional resources for the war's turning point, and said nothing at all about a young man who had fallen through a tear in the sky and spent 3 weeks giving everything he had to a city that had no claim on him beyond the simple, ordinary fact of strangers needing help. But some things survived the official record regardless. Dana Whitfield, rebuilding her family's bakery on a street that had, against all odds, been spared the worst of the fires, told her children and grandchildren, for the whole of her long life, about the young man in the black coat who had stopped 4 strangers from dying in an alley on the war's very first night and asked for nothing in return. Captain Rowe, promoted twice in the years that followed, kept a small, private ritual of raising a glass each year on the anniversary of Lambeth Bridge to a debt he never fully stopped feeling. And in the Hellsing family's private records, not the official ledger's Section 13 or the Round Table would ever see, but Integra's own quiet, personal accounts, there remained, for the whole of her long tenure as this organization's commander, a simple, handwritten note. Some debts are not meant to be repaid. They are meant to be honored by becoming, in turn, the kind of ally someone else once was for you. Somewhere else, in a world of dungeons and hunters, and a war that had never truly stopped, Sung Jin-Woo returned to a life that needed him just as urgently as London once had. But he carried with him, always, the quiet, hard-won memory of a burning city that had taught him something he hadn't fully understood before falling through that tear in the sky. That the weight of protecting people who couldn't protect themselves was never, in the end, a burden carried alone. It was a debt paid forward, city to city, world to world, by anyone willing to stand in the burning street and simply, stubbornly, refuse to let the fire win.